I grew up in an area of rural East Texas dominated by a large river and an ancient primal forest. This area would often flood, usually about once or twice a year, leaving people particularly isolated for several days to a week. Everyone out there has their stories. You practically can't spend more than a month out there without something strange happening. I spent the first 16 years of my life out there, and the things that I experienced caused so many problems for me. Problems that I'm only recently getting over. I obsessed over these events, wound up with a lifelong interest in the occult, probably from studying paranormal events as a way to build a mental framework to understand everything that happened out there. Things are better now. I finally accepted that I'll never understand, that these questions will never be answered. The land itself was heavily forested, as I mentioned above. The actual layout was river bottoms and hills. Most houses were built on top of the hills because of the annual flooding. This will have to be a series. I have stories not only of my 16 years there, but from my mother, father, older brother, friends, and other family members. The first story that I would like to tell started before I was born. I used to know the exact date, but a house fire took my original notes about 10 years ago. My mother, father, and older brother, who would have been very young at the time, were home during a flood. Our house was on the top of a hill next to my grandparents' house and my aunt's house. During the floods, we would all just hang out together and wait for the waters to recede. This usually took between 3 to 7 days. Typically, the power would go out after a day or so. All the households over there had boats, canoes, kayaks, little fishing boats. Living out there with the flooding, rivers and creeks made boat ownership necessary. So during this flood, on one of the early nights, my family were visited by a neighbor who had boated over, a 40-something woman from down the road, highly religious, from one of the more extreme sectors of either Southern Baptist or Pentecostal that were common out there. No drinking, no swearing, no dancing, etc. This woman barged into our house demanding to know where the booze was kept, calling my parents filthy names. They offered her some of my dad's beer, but she didn't want it, opting instead to chug the bottle of rubbing alcohol from the bathroom before leaving. My family figured she had had a psychotic break. Her next-door neighbor found her after the waters had dropped. She was dead in her house, apparently ripped apart by some animal. No one really mentions her out there. She had no family, no real friends out there. I found out more when I was a teenager and I interviewed her neighbor. He was a school friend's uncle. My friend actually lived in the woman's old house at that point, and he wasn't all there. I only mention this because he lacked the intelligence and imagination to make up the things that he told me. He said that while the woman was ripped apart, chewed, clawed to pieces, there were things written in her blood all over the walls. He showed me some stuff that he had copied down. Strange symbols and veves, but nothing matching anything that I've seen since. After all these years, I truly believe it was nonsense, just gibberish. I wish that I had something more concrete, an answer, that I could point and say there were symbols from this system or beliefs denoting this specific usage or meaning. But unfortunately, nothing added up. That man died a few months after telling me this. Nothing mysterious or sinister, just a stupid accident. He set fire to himself in his house, smoking while cleaning engine parts and gasoline. Almost killed my friend too. His stores of ammunition caught fire and began going off like fireworks. About a year after that dim-witted neighbor had died, his niece had contacted me. She was a year younger than me, and one day she tells me that her brother is getting out of prison and moving in with them. He had been in for a non-violent robbery, a snatch and grabs basically. He was about 18 or 19, I believe. She calls me one day and says my brother wants to speak to me. I agree and he comes over. He starts asking me all sorts of questions about the occult and about the thing in the woods. And the majority of the upcoming stories will be about those woods. I tell him some of my pet theories that I was holding at the time, and he asked to see some of my books. So I loan him a couple. A few weeks later, he's dead. He had been paid to kidnap somebody's grandmother and kill her for insurance money. The cops had located the car before he did anything, and he killed himself rather than go to prison. The woman that he kidnapped swore up and down that he wasn't really going to hurt her, that he was roped into it and trying to find a place to hide her. I know this sounds unrelated, but after the funeral and life returning somewhat to normal, my friend, she confessed to me why her brother wanted to talk to the weird kid down the road with the obsession with paranormal stuff. She said that he had been seeing shadows in the woods out of his window, and he had heard things whispering to him. Some of the sketches in his journal looked like the same types of symbols that their uncle had shown me. I'll post more stories about the area tomorrow. This next story happened when I was probably about 9 or 10. The hilltop my house was on had 4 houses, one a little down one side that had some oddball neighbors. They'll figure in at some later story. My house, my grandfather's house, and my aunt's house. My aunt's spouse had kids from a previous marriage, one of whom was close to my age and my best friend growing up. The 3 family plots of land took up about 100 acres of land. Only a small amount was cleared. The majority of it was the forest. Past our houses in the backyards, the hill would dip down. There were a few lakes and then a sharp cliff with a creek at the bottom that marked the beginning of the forest. Since the land was so large, my dad had bought a golf cart to help with yard work, and I always enjoyed driving it around the land, through the trails and roads on the edges of the forest in between the houses. One day the family went out to some function and I decided to stay at home. My parents had already split up, so Dad was gone. My grandfather, my aunt, her partner, and my mother had all gone off to the function. The reason I stayed was my aunt's adopted son, C, was coming home that day. He had been off visiting his father and I hadn't seen him for a couple weeks. I figured I would goof around alone for a while, and then play with my friend when he got back. I got bored with Nintendo, and so I grabbed my cassette player and hopped on the golf cart and started driving around the yard and trails. The trails towards the cliff were dark and under a canopy of trees. You could just make the shape of the start of the real forest through them and past the cliff. I followed them around to the front yards past my aunt's house, where the cleared land stopped and rejoined a tributary along the edge of the woods, and I thought that I heard somebody calling my name. I paused the tape and listened, and eventually I heard it again. It sounded almost like a whisper, but from far off, strangely carrying more than a real whisper would. I took the headphones completely off and listened again and began looking around and heard nothing. I was about to drive off when I saw something in the tree line, right at the edge of the clearing. It looked like a person, tall and thin, but made entirely out of shadow. It was standing upright, though not against the ground or a tree, but a freestanding, vaguely human-shaped shadow. As young as I was, I grew up out of there and was fairly bright for a kid. I read constantly and I knew that human brains try to pick out familiar shapes out of jumbles, but I kept staring at it, and that's when it started moving. Always facing me, but moving towards the edge of the fence, where it broke from a rotted post. I floored the cart and drove up the hill to my aunt's house, and that's where things took a turn. My aunt's house was one story but had a sharply steeped roof, giving it a tall attic. There was a large vent in the attic a few feet above the back door. At one point it was either wooden or metal slats, but that vent had fallen off years earlier and been replaced with a tarp. I quickly got out to the top of the hill in the clearing of my aunt's yard, close to the back door. I heard a quick rustling sound and looked towards it. The attic. The tarp had partially come undone and was hanging down, exposing most of the vent hole. I'm guessing about 5 foot by 5 foot, maybe a bit smaller. Standing in the attic in the sunlight from the hole was a terrifying figure, something that I'll never forget. It was nude, somewhere between 5.5 feet to 6 feet tall, and staring down into the yard at me. My heart leaped into my throat and I was frozen. It wasn't just that there was a stranger in my aunt's attic or even the nudity. It was that it looked like a layer of its skin had been removed, either scrubbed or bleached off. No muscle tissue was exposed, but what looked like exposed fat and a texture and coloring that I believe were veins were clearly visible. The eyes stood out the most. The eyelids were completely gone, leaving this horrifying expression on the thing's face. We stared at each other for a few moments and then the thing turned and vanished. Not literally, just turned and went back into the attic past the view that the angle in the sunlight had granted. The realization that it could be going down into the house and out the door broke my paralysis, and I hit the gas and drove back to my house at top speed. Probably only about 25 to 30 miles per hour, honestly. I ran inside and I locked the doors. My family kept guns in the house. My dad had been gone a while, but some of his were still left behind. I grabbed my mother's snub-nosed .38 out of her closet and my dad's shotgun, and I waited in the kitchen near the phone and the window facing the road, waiting for Aaron's dad's car to go past. I must have waited over an hour staring out the window, looking immediately towards the slightest sound. Eventually, I saw the car drive past and turn down their driveway. I immediately started calling over and over again until my friend had picked up the phone. I immediately began shouting at him to go out the back door and run to my house. The front door was next to the hallway that led to the bathroom where the attic entrance was. I wanted him to get as far away from it as possible. Aaron seemed confused and said that he would be right over. And then I heard a loud banging sound over the phone and the sound of Aaron screaming. I heard the phone clatter, and a few moments later, I could see him running up the path between our houses as fast as he could. I let him into the house and he told me that while he was on the phone with me, he heard the sound of the attic door banging open and somebody unfolding the ladder. This was a double fold. Gravity alone wouldn't cause that. He said that before he was able to get to the back, he could hear something coming down the stairs. That's all for tonight, everyone. I'll post again tomorrow evening. It appears that one of my friends from that time period is reading up on here. This next story actually involved the both of us. This next story takes place a few years later, probably around spring of 2001. I had moved out of state for a few years and had only recently moved back. I wasn't living out in the country again, but in a nearby small town only a short distance away. My friend Brad and I decided to start up our old investigative team again for old time's sake. And we were both getting older, both divorced but still pretty young. I guess we were trying to be kids together for a while. There's another tiny community close to the one that we grew up in that is somewhat famous for the ghost lights seen often. The town's name is Saratoga, and the road is called Bragg Road, informally known as the Ghost Light Road. Saratoga has a very small population, and at the time only a couple stores, a general store, a gas station, and a feed store, and a few small churches. Aside from that, it borders on protective forest preservations and backwoods oil fields. The town is right on the edge of a giant glob of a big thicket. Bragg Road itself connects two small highways. It's unpaved dirt and goes for a little over 7 miles. The local legend is that a train hand was beheaded and is walking about the now-removed train tracks looking for his severed head. The light that you see is his lantern. Nobody who's seen the lights or studied them believe this. For one, the lights look nothing like a lantern light. They are groups of spherical lights ranging from about 2 to 7 feet across, usually pale yellow, green, blue, or red. They float about sometimes in formations, sometimes more scattered, and gently bob and change direction. They have been observed to react to sound, particularly when people shout at them. I've noticed that myself on a much earlier trip. Brad and I met at his apartment and headed out fairly early. We swapped stories that we had both heard, reminisced about past adventures in Saratoga and other places, and joked. We had a little mini cassette recorder, Diane, with us, a couple cameras, and that was about it. One of the stories that we were discussing was about my neighbors growing up. These complete rednecks that lived halfway down my family's hill. They had told us the lights chased them until they were towards the end of the road. The man then got out to piss, came back covered in blood and cuts, and told his wife that the light had touched him and had caused the cuts. They were two crazy, drug-addled alcoholics, but I had heard more stories from more reputable people about the lights causing cuts and burns when touched, so I always wondered if maybe that was correct. Brad and I decided that we would test that out if the chance came about. The lights don't always show up. We arrived in Saratoga much earlier than we had expected, so we decided to do some exploring. We stopped at this general store and bought some candy chip soda and some bug spray, and then took my tiny little car out into the trails in the Big Thicket Preserve. We passed oil derricks, abandoned and operating, and kept taking the creepiest looking roads further into the wood. Eventually, we see a sign marked Teal Cemetery and decided that was good enough for a destination to kill the remaining daylight before going light hunting. The road was narrow, not just unpaved, but muddy and scary in a two-wheel drive tiny car. It was flanked on both sides with forest so dense that it looked like night between the trees. Eventually, we came to a large, circular clearing with a square fenced-in cemetery in the center. We parked my car and got out. The moment that we got out of my car, we both felt an instant sickness and fear. Every instinct that I had was telling me that this place was bad. Very bad, and that we should get back in the car and drive very, very fast out of here. The mosquitoes were so thick that you could hear a loud hum coming from the forest. I looked at Brad and he nodded. "I feel it too, man," he said. "I guess this is our campsite then?" I asked. He grinned uneasily and nodded, and then we began exploring the cemetery. There were so many weird things in that cemetery. I remember walking about and seeing a place where a couple thin decorative trees and bushes had grown in an odd fashion. It was like they were making a bubble, like a little yurt or something. My head was telling me that it was nature covering something from sight, trying to erase it. I got down on my hands and knees and crawled into the interior of the bubble, brushing leaves and limbs away, and saw that even the grass was growing in that weird fashion. It was covering up a gravestone. Not one of the standing ones, but one of the flat ones, lying face up into the earth. I reached out to brush the grass aside so that I could read the names and dates on it, but as soon as my hand touched the stone, there was a loud noise. It sounded like a vibrating, buzzing sound. The stone itself felt like it was vibrating under my hand. It was like a high-speed fan was under it, and the tiny blades were clacking it very rapidly. The sensation and sound scared the crap out of me, and I leaped back and immediately crawled out of the bubble. I looked about for Brad and didn't see him at first. He had gone back to the car to grab the cigarettes. I waved at him to come over and he nodded, moving towards the chain-link fence. And then he stopped. A weird expression came over his face. He was standing outside the cemetery looking in, looking at something on the ground. "Martin, come over here, where I'm looking," he said. I walked towards him, and when I got a few feet away from the fence, I saw it. It was a large, rectangular hole in the ground, about the size of a grave, but much more raw and rough. "Is that what I think it is?" he asked. "I don't know. I don't think so," I said. I looked at the hole carefully. It was deep, but not terribly so. Maybe 4 feet at the worst of it. There were weird grooves on the side and a smaller rectangular hole in front of it, running the other direction. As Brad approached, I had an idea to lay in the hole. There were chunks of rotted wood stuck in the clay, but not much. It was about the right fit. When I reached my arms up to climb out, they sank into natural grooves. My fingers even found finger holes there. I pushed myself out. From Brad's expression, I saw that he noticed the implications there. "That has to be a prank. Nothing is that perfect," I said. He nodded. I still mostly believe that today. Brad and I continued exploring the cemetery, noticing some old graves back from the Civil War era. And then both of us saw a path into the woods, past the fence at the back of the cemetery, opposite the road that led us here. "We're going in," I said. Brad grinned and we hopped the fence. Both of us had grown up out here. Both of us had about 2 decades of horrible experiences out there, and both of us had almost died from these things before, but this was our obsession. We walked into the forest. The footpath led us maybe half a mile or so into the woods, just enough light coming down to see clearly, and then we saw something that made us forget everything else that we had seen so far. A perfect circle straight ahead, in the middle of a very lush and thriving, very alive forest, there was a perfect circle of dead. The ground looked like dried clay and sand, cracked despite the almost constant rainfall. The leaves that had fallen in weren't just brown and dried like those outside the circle, but black and rotted. We looked at the trees and bushes. Some had branches that had penetrated the circumference of the circle. They were living in grain until the breach, and then crumbling to dust. I looked around, looked at Brad, and then stepped into the circle. The moment I did, all sound stopped. The crickets and cicadas had stopped their humming, and the sounds of the mosquitoes stopped. Even the rustling of the trees stopped. I got a sick feeling in my stomach again, a brief, dizzy spell. Brad was staring at me a little concerned. I shook my head. "I'm fine. Hand me that stick," I said, pointing at a large, jagged, heavy log. Brad picked it up and handed it to me. "Something's buried in here. I don't know why, but I just felt certain that there was something under there." I grabbed the stick with both hands and began busting the large clods of earth up and flinging them out of the circle. As soon as I did that, Brad and I heard an insanely loud roar come from deeper into the woods, almost like a bear but louder. My heart started racing and we looked at each other, and then we heard something far, far worse. Something big, very big, running through the woods at us. We could see the pine trees being shook and pushed aside deep into the woods. "Go, go!" Brad yelled and we both ran, probably faster than we ever had before or since, back up the path towards the cemetery. The crashing and stopping, Christ, you could almost feel the vibration in the ground, following us and catching up. We hit the clearing, and I've never been terribly athletic, but I vaulted over that chain link fence into the cemetery without a single ounce of difficulty and ran towards the gate, and my car just passed it. The thing didn't follow us out of the forest and into the clearing, but we could feel its presence, and anger, rage even. We bolted to my car, it started right up, and we drove very fast down that road until we got out of the woods. The entire way out of there, it seemed like shadows were following the car, keeping pace in the woods beside us. We got out, drove to the highway and the entrance to Bragg Road, and confirmed what we both saw to each other. Our experiences matched. We smoked, drank our sodas and waters, and calmed down. Darkness had fallen by this point, so we decided to go down Bragg Road and continue the look for the lights. We did see the lights from a distance, but never got close. They all seemed to be moving backwards towards the preserve, and we presumed the cemetery. Eventually, we decided to go back. I wish I could say that something more exciting happened when we returned, but unfortunately no. We got back to the cemetery and it was dark. The same sick feeling like we were being watched, but nothing else. We soon decided that we were pushing our luck well past the point of sanity, and we left to go home. Last year, I went back to Saratoga and managed to find the cemetery. The hole and grave wasn't there anymore, and neither was the bubble. The path was there, though not in the place I remembered it, and we did find the circle. I took some soil samples. I might take some pictures of them and post later. Thanks for reading. I'll have more tomorrow. At the bottom of one side of my family's hill, there was a really poorly made one-story red house. The families came and went from that house, and most didn't make it past a year or so, because once the floodwaters came, the house's roof would be 10 feet underwater. It was always in some form of disrepair or another, and family after family of redneck or white trash would move in and out of it. Most took to dumping trash in the ditch across the road. There was no carpeting or hardwood. If anyone had ever been dumb enough to install it, the multiple floods had long since destroyed them, so it was simply concrete flooring and warped wooden walls, windows, and doors. I remember the driveway was covered in white shells. The house always smelled bad too. Generations of flooding and molding wood will do that. I had known some of the families that had lived there over the years. Some even had kids around my age that I would play with. I learned pretty quick never to get too attached to the kids because usually they would move off after the first major flood. The land had a fairly large pond on the side that led to a large and strange natural pit. The pit was lined with clay and only occasionally had water in it. We used to pretend to be cave explorers and climb down into it and explore the weird tunnels until we hit water or found our way to the creek that ran behind all of our properties. My friend Aaron and I would play back there, actually more especially when it was vacant. Later on, my friend Patrick would join us as well. We loved playing in the woods, building forts out of pine trees, swinging on vines across the cliff. It was kind of awesome in its own way. All of us knew about the weirdness, but I suppose we adapted the same way people who live in dangerous neighborhoods or cities and they still go for walks. You know it's dangerous, but it's still home. You can get used to anything, I suppose. I've always loved going for long walks. Living way out in the boonies like that, no one really worried about it. No one worried about being kidnapped or anything. And they knew that I knew the back roads in the woods like the back of my own hand. So sometimes I would go walking through the woods or the roads for hours at a time. Sometimes I would have my little Walkman. Sometimes just thinking or enjoying the scenery. I still love to walk. My hips and legs are a little jacked up from a car accident that I had a few years back, but I still do it, still enjoy it. On one day when I was about 12 or 13, I was returning home down our road after one of these long walks. I was passing the red house and I glanced over at it. It had been empty for a year or more and was in an even worse state than usual. The windows were completely clear of glass or screens. The doors were wobbly and the house had this derelict, dirty look about it. Not overgrown much, just a few tall weeds here and there. I got curious and decided to go look in, see if anything had been left behind after the last family had moved. I remember the sound of the shells crunching underfoot, and there must have been chalk on them or something, because they left this white dust on everything that they touched. I pulled the front door open. Actually, the front of the house didn't have a door. It was the side covered by a porch, and I walked in. The house smelled of dust, mold, mud, and rot. Not overwhelming, but I could imagine how difficult it must have been to live there in that constant scent. The house was mostly barren. A few rotted posters were up, but that was about it. I walked through the bedrooms and bathrooms, keeping an eye out for snakes. I wasn't too worried. The only snakes that bothered me were cottonmouths, and you could smell them a mile off. They stink terribly. I was in the heart of the house when I heard a loud bang. It was the sound of the door slamming shut. I immediately began moving through the house stealthily, trying to avoid being seen. I could hear slow, steady footsteps moving through the house, making no effort to be quiet. I reached the back door and tried to pull it open, but it was stuck. Now, I want to be clear that it wasn't magically forced closed or anything. The frame and door had just warped it, and it was very, very hard to open. I finally forced it open and ran into the backyard and moved towards the road. I looked back and saw a figure on the porch, just silently watching me. The figure was at first like the shadow things that I had described earlier, but I was able to get a much better look at it through the empty windows on the closed-in front porch. It was tall and gaunt. Its skin was gray and wrinkled, almost desiccated, like a man aged far past the point of normal human life. It wore a black, wide-brimmed hat, and the eyes were like green fire, balls of green light. That was the only time I saw something with that description. I did hear others describe something similar later on in life when I began asking my own questions. I'll be back tomorrow evening with another story. Thanks for reading. I mentioned in earlier posts how even after all these disturbing incidents that my friends and I continued to walk in the woods, camp out there, and eventually started actively seeking this out. I compared it to how you normalize living in a violent neighborhood after a while. We all used to camp in the woods past the creek far behind my house. Those woods were strange, and it took me several years to notice some of the strangest things about them. In fact, it wasn't until I moved out and started really thinking about the layout of the land that the really bizarre aspects became noticeable. I'll describe that and then tell of a particular incident out in the woods. So, from my back porch, you could walk down the hill away from the road past my pond and then hit the cliff, across the creek, climb up the other side of the cliff, and then enter the forest proper. It steadily climbed upwards, the trees getting more and more thick, pine and hardwoods both. If you kept going, it became less pine and more hardwood, and it took on a completely different appearance. Then going further on, you would hit rocks, fallen trees, what looked like a former dried-out swamp, and another cliff that we never went past. The land past there was rocky, mostly barren, and you could see what looked like rocky hills or maybe dark mountains off in the distance. They were too far off and mostly uninteresting compared to the woods. And this was a few miles of walking before you would even hit that. The weird bit is, it should have only been a mile or so before getting to the highway, and there are no mountains or rocky hills out there. But we all saw this multiple times and just sort of accepted it. None of us ever really went very far past the end of the woods to the barren rocky parts, not out of feeling creeped out or anything, just a complete lack of interest in doing so. It was years and years later when I was on a job and driving past the highway that the turnoff into my old homestead was on that it suddenly dawned on me that we never hit the road. We never got out of the woods. I called a few friends of mine and brought up the mountains, and oddly enough, they remembered them, and it was only me bringing it up that brought their attention to how strange that was. One year, my big brother and I cut down some smaller trees, fashioned a crude hut out of them. I brought some stones from some of the ditches up there, made a fireplace, and even used ropes and things to coax some of the smaller, more malleable trees to grow sideways for a while to make living seating. This became our regular campsite. I had walked out there after school to relax, smoke cigarettes, later on some pot, and just to get away. And Patrick and I had been camping out there often, almost every weekend for a while. We would play out there and either sleep out there or come home and bored to watch movies and play some video games. Sometimes when we were out there, we would see the shadow things, usually off out past the clearing that we had built or up in the trees, watching us. It was usually very, very brief. Just a few moments of seeing a human-shaped figure just at the edge of the light watching us, and then turning and vanishing into the woods. And one night it got worse. We had my stereo out there loaded up with D-cells, listening to CDs and smoking cigarettes that I had stolen from my mother. We had a fire going, but it had gone down to embers, and since there was a stone enclosure, we never worried much about it. Between the stones and the almost constant rainfall out there, forest fires never seemed a threat. Patrick and I were laying back, music playing, talking about whatever was on our minds when I noticed 3 of them high up in the trees watching us. Patrick? Yeah, I see them too, Martin. We had gotten used to being observed for a time and then left alone, so we kept our eyes on them. And then we heard snapping twigs and leaves from further off in the woods and saw more of them. They made us nervous. They had never been quite so bold before. We stood up and heard more and more of them coming out of the woods. We stayed in the enclosure for a while, wondering what to do. And then both of us felt a surge of panic at the same time when we bolted through the woods. As soon as we did, we could hear something running behind us. I remember feeling something hitting my back. By that point, I could just make out the distant light of my house, far up the hill and past the cliffs. Something hit my back again and I fell, falling face first down the cliff, knocking the wind out of me. Patrick just jumped, helped me to my feet, and we continued running, now in the clearing of the backyard until we topped the hill and got inside. My clothes were muddy. I had avoided rolling into the creek, but the foliage was wet and the ground was kind of muddy. I took my shirt off and saw that it was covered in blood. Patrick looked scared and told me to go to the bathroom. There were several claw marks down my back. They healed up pretty well. There's still some faint lines there today, but nothing major. Just enough to free bleed for a while. We slept in the house that night and the next morning walked back out there to grab the stereo. Everything was just as we had left it. Oddly enough, even after that incident, we still kept camping out there. Sorry, this one is kind of short. There will be more tomorrow. Sorry about the 2-day delay. This has been an absolutely stressful weekend and I had no time to write. I still barely do and I didn't sleep much. I'll post a much longer one once I've rested a bit tomorrow. A long winding creek wove its way through the small community that I lived in. The same creek ran under the bridge behind the house and under 2 more bridges before leaving my road. A few minor tributaries also ran through the woods themselves. The bridges that went over these were mostly creosote-soaked wood with metal cord guardrails. 2 of them were completely without guardrails and driving over them could get nerve-wracking. We used to play under those bridges as a kid, building dams, forts, or just hiding out smoking. One year, one of our neighbors had the clay ditch lined with stones full of quartz, so we used those, sticks, and everything else that we had to create the dam. It's still there over 20 years later. Changed the course of the creek a little bit, and I'm proud of that. The woods on the other side had their own weirdness. We had to be more careful in those particular sections of the woods because they weren't on private land. We would still wander around them, though, and I'm fairly confident that my friends and I knew the woods better than anyone else. One particular place always stuck out. My brother had shown me when I was a kid. We would walk down the first bridge, jump down, and then walk past and over the creek and to the left and eventually find this covered pavilion with a tin roof and dirt floor, an old sink and a hand pump. Years later, I took my friends out there occasionally. We would bring food and drinks, sometimes even camp out there. When I moved out of state, I missed the places terribly and would tell my wife about the beautiful woods and the campsites. Over the holidays one year, my wife and I drove back home to visit my family and friends. During this trip, she wanted to see some of those places that she had heard about, so we drove out to my neighborhood with Brad. We told her some of the stories of the weird things out there, some of which have already been posted here. We parked next to the bridge closest to my old house and decided to walk around. It was probably about 9 or 10 at night. Brad left the tape recorder on the hood to see if we could get anything weird while we were away. We left the windows down and started walking further down the road. Brad and I showed my wife, long since divorced, some of the areas that she had heard about. We checked out under both bridges, walked out to that pavilion and to Brad's old home. On the way out of the woods, my wife started getting nervous, swearing that she could see things in the woods. Brad and I assured her that if we stayed calm, we could get to the car before anything happened. We were smoking on the second bridge when we saw figures walking down the road. We started walking back to the car, looking back to see the grayish, vaguely human shape. We were walking fast but not really running. The thing was keeping pace with us, and then my ex, she just lost it and bolted. As soon as she did, we heard rustling from the woods running next to us, trying to cut us off at the turn before we reached the car. I unlocked the doors and ran around to get into the driver's seat. I hopped in and heard my wife scream and saw her getting pulled from the car. I grabbed her arm and pulled her back. She slammed the door and we drove off. After leaving the thicket, we talked. The reason that she had taken off running was she had looked over the bridge and saw something that looked like a large skull. She described it as about 3 times the size of a normal human skull, on top of a body made of what looked like tree limbs, vines, leaves, and rotten vegetation. She said that it looked like it was about to climb onto the bridge, though she ran. She didn't see what had grabbed her. She believed it was that thing. After arriving at the house, we listened to the tape and heard something strange. You can hear us talking, laughing, and walking away, and then you hear us driving off. There's nothing in between. Just a seamless transition between us walking away and walking back. Although we experienced at least 2 hours of time, only 2 or 3 minutes passed. Even my wife's scream didn't show up. Only the sounds of us closing the doors, nervously talking and driving off. This next story is a bit shorter and not nearly as dramatic as some of the rest. I hope that nobody is too terribly disappointed in this, but I felt it was important to describe some of the more simple, less dramatic events that took place out there. Previously, I had touched upon the weird spatial issues with the land. I described how we never hit the highway even after crossing miles of land. I also mentioned the landscapes that don't actually exist out there. Sometimes other things in that vein happened. Sometimes it felt like we had left our area and subtly entered somewhere else. Patrick and I had once read that closed structures, particularly natural triangles, were problematic to walk through, and one should never do this. I'm still somewhat phobic of that to this day. I walk around my city regularly and still have the habit of watching for triangular formations. Sort of an OCD type thing, but you'll soon see why I have this phobia. I will break this routine if I'm with somebody that I care about and they cross through. I'll follow them through and try to keep pace with them. It's strange, it's insane. And this is why I harp upon why I don't really study this stuff anymore, and why I feel like my time out there almost completely ruined me as a person. A friend of mine described it almost like a mild case of PTSD, but I don't want to go that far. Patrick, Aaron, Brad, and I spent a lot of time exploring the woods behind my house. One day, Aaron and I were going to the furthest edges of the family land and discovered a very well-built deer stand. Closed in, nice little clubhouse. It was still very much our land, so we felt absolutely zero guilt painting it and claiming it, and even booby-trapping it again in case the poachers came back. And we would bring picnic stuff, tools, and spend all day out there, landscaping a bit, making it suit us more. One day we came back and found that the booby traps had been sprung. I think the poachers got the message and never returned after that. There was one summer morning where Patrick and I walked out there, spent several hours reading, talking, and just goofing around in the woods. We got hungry and decided to head back. About halfway, something seemed a bit off. It was hard to put our fingers on it, but something wasn't right. The colors of the sky looked slightly off. The sounds of the forest were a little different. Nothing that most people would ever notice, but we grew up out there and knew that area so intimately that any difference became noticeable. We grew ever more and more uneasy as we left the woods. We crossed the creek and began the climb up the hill towards my house. My house was painted green, it always had been. My house was still green, but kind of a yellow-green. The old Jeep that my dad left behind was gone. The trees were a little off place. It was my home, but just off. And Patrick and I started to go towards the house to investigate further, but both of us got a very bad feeling about getting too close to the actual house or the barn. We both turned and went back into our woods, retraced our steps, and found our way back to the deer stand. We smoked some, filched cigarettes, calmed ourselves, and then walked back in a different route. This time, things felt right, but after discussing things together later on, we both felt that we had nearly avoided something terrible. I'm not sure what happened there. This could very well have been just overactive imaginations. We never saw any shadow figures or other things. Just that feeling of things being slightly off. Sorry too if the posting is slowed down. Things have been difficult lately. I'll try to write more often, and one of my friends who was mentioned in this series might be taking the reins in a separate but connected series, and I'll add some comments there. I'll link to that series whenever it gets around to it. My current group is wanting to see these places. Sometime soon we'll travel out there so that I can show them. Whenever that happens, I'll take pictures and I'll post a story about it. Also, if anybody is interested in me answering questions or filling in any blanks that might have been left in these stories, feel free to leave me a question in the comments and I'll answer to the best of my ability. This next story is kind of a wraparound. For some reason, I felt like I was increasingly more and more of a target out there. Possibly it was just my constant proximity. Possibly I just didn't hear from others going through the same regular events. It became more and more frequent until I finally moved out, and some of the events seemed directed specifically at me. I would be in my room sometimes and hear people talking outside. Sometimes a serration, sometimes actual words. Occasionally it sounded a bit like people that I know. I was worried that the stress was getting to me and my mind was cracking, but others heard as similar things out there when alone. The most common voices were the sounds of young children laughing and playing. There's an old creepypasta out there that I swear was written by someone that I've either known or talked to this stuff about with before. I think it's called Upstairs. A similar event happened to me at my house. I was home alone and heard my mother calling me from inside another room in the house. I called back and she just repeated my name, calling me again until I got up to go look for her. As I was about to enter that room, I heard my mother's car pulling up and I saw her parking. Things like this happened fairly often. Between that and being chased through the woods multiple times, the man in the red house, all of this, it seemed like I had more experiences than most people. Everyone saw things, just not nearly as often as I did. As I got older, I began to get obsessed with tracking down where all these things were coming from. I never definitively found the source, but there was a spot that always worried me. There was a pond in my yard at the bottom of the hill, close to the creek that bisected the land. It was on the right-hand side if your back was to the road and you were facing the woods. There was a ditch that ran all along the fence line on that side that had weird things all through it. A gate that led to nowhere. One day, that gate vanished with no explanation. Pieces of houses were out there, and we were the first people to live out there. We had cleared the land. There were no spaces for houses and from the age of the trees, not for hundreds of years. And finally, this small wooden wall made of very, very old wood, with a small door or portal where the rain went down right at the edge of the pond. These oddities weren't even really in the woods. They were in my backyard on the fence line that ran between the road to the drop-off. That little wall portal thing always gave me the creeps ever since I was a kid. I had a reoccurring dream or maybe memory of being in the canoe and desperately trying to paddle backwards away from it while being drawn towards the thing. I was never sure if that was just a dream or an old memory, but whenever I was near the wall, that scene would play out vividly to me. I was so scared of that wall, but also strangely drawn to it. A little ways down the road, let's call it Broad Cloak Road. It was actually named after my last name, but my last name isn't really Broadcloak. There was yet another abandoned house. A little shack even smaller than the red house but not nearly as low, so it didn't go underwater when the floods came in. I remember my big brother once had something to do with the house. I'm not sure if he worked on it, stayed in it for a while. I really doubt that. While it wasn't as decrepit as the red house, it wasn't really in livable condition. Or maybe he just hung out there with his friends when he was my age. I would occasionally explore and look around the house, never going in. Bushes and thorns had covered the entrances, but wandering around outside it and trying to peek in. There was another much smaller pond a little ways down from that house, natural wood going gray, and another odd hole in the ground that sort of reminded me of that wall and portal down by my pond. The house was creepy, but not the absolutely terrifying place that some of the others were. Sinister, otherworldly almost, dangerous even, but not the feeling of absolutely must run. Well, that changed one night. One day I went to bed. I don't specifically recall what I was doing when I went to sleep, but at the time I think I did. I don't think there's a specific blank spot in my memory. I think that the 2 decades have just faded at this point. I woke up cold and uncomfortable. I was not in my room. It was very dark around me and I could smell earth and stone. My night vision was excellent at the time. I had some eye surgeries as a child and some botching in them caused my eyes to get a bit more light than most people. I could read in a dark room. And nowadays my vision is degraded actually for the same reason. 30 plus years of getting that much extra light has damaged them further. I could see, but just barely. I was scared, but I managed to not completely panic. Off in the distance, I heard running water and decided to move that way, figuring that I might be able to climb out of some runoff hole. As my eyes adjusted a little further, I could see that I was in some kind of tunnel. Mostly clay, some rock and some root systems breaking through in a few places, so I knew that I wasn't too deep, just a few feet underground. As I got closer to the running water sound, I started getting more and more panicked. I felt like something was in there with me. I didn't see or hear anything, just this feeling of some presence down there with me. My feet hit water and moonlight was spilling in. I could see the sky. And that's when I got very, very scared. I could see the boards of that wall near my pond. I had walked a good distance at that point. I looked around and saw some water running down, I presume from the pond. Just a small stream going downwards. There was an even deeper pit leading further down, and that was where I felt the presence was coming from. I stared into it, even my eyes couldn't see much around me, much less down that hole, and I suddenly felt like something was wrong and that I needed to leave. Later on, I thought perhaps whatever it was waking up, but that's just speculation. I ran the other direction, banging into the walls until I saw light again. The hole was lined with thorns near the top. I cut myself up pretty bad, but I got through and found myself near that old house, emerging from that hole that I had mentioned earlier. I had traveled a fair enough distance, but still only maybe a 5 or 10 minute walk from my house. I walked back, cleaned the dirt off myself, and watched the sun come up. Talking to my family later on, long after we had moved, I found out that many of them also experienced weird things similar to mine. My entire family heard the children laughing and playing often, especially my grandmother who died when I was 1. My grandfather mentioned seeing a gray-skinned man to me once, shortly before he died. The other voices were mentioned, the weird structures were just overlooked. I think something compelled me to sleepwalk down into that tunnel. I think that was the moment that things started targeting me. Some other things happened later that showed some strange connection that I have with the events out there. We moved out of there when I was 16. We sold the house to a nice young couple, kind of redneck, but they were sweet. I saw them only once a couple years later and they looked a bit haggard. The man whom I had gotten along with very well was nervous around me. He finally told me that they had been experiencing haunting-like incidents, but then they mentioned seeing me around, a younger version of me. He knew that I lived out of state by then too, but it made him nervous to be around me. Things didn't go so well for that couple. The stress wound up driving him insane. He wound up going berserk. His wife left him. He went gun crazy and shot up his own truck. He got involved with some teenage girl down the road who kept cattle and land recently cleared behind that gray house until committing suicide in the barn. The Trinity River cuts a very deep ravine close to where I grew up. When I was very young, we used to go play out on the banks, boat, fishing, camp out there. When I became a teenager, it became a popular destination for parties. I guess the riverside version of a beach party. Lots of tents, kegs, etc. My friends and I camped out there occasionally. Sometimes when the water was high, we would load camping gear into the boat and follow the creek until it connected to the Trinity. There were some nice, really isolated spots out there, perfect for a campfire and conversation. The banks were tall and really steep, especially on the opposite face. 20 to 30 foot drop off at the shortest, sometimes much higher, and at the top of the cliff, the forest resumed. And this part was a very thick forest, very old and completely blocked off from the light from the treetops. And Patrick and I liked exploring a lot and used to set up camp and then boat further down, looking for interesting things. One time we went out there and found an old decrepit house, 2-story, insanely weathered, slightly leaning off to one side. We anchored the boat to a log and climbed the cliffs to look at it. This wasn't that unusual. It seemed like there was a small community out there, possibly around the late 1800s to the very early 1900s. Occasionally, the course of the river would shift a bit and the cliff location would shift with it. I think most of the houses got lost in a landslide a long time ago. To find one of those houses in that good of condition was kind of insane. Most of the others were a little more than rubble. The house was 2-story and very overgrown with weeds and bushes, and even trees that had grown into the house in a few parts. Only one window still had glass in it. Patrick and I cleared a path up to the house and started wandering around looking for anything interesting that might have been left behind. There wasn't much. We found a few pieces of glassware, an old lamp, some broken furniture, including a rocking chair that must have been nice at one point but was too rotted to sit in. This was wintertime, otherwise we wouldn't have gone in. Old houses and shacks are really great places to find clusters of cottonmouths, rattlesnakes, or copperheads. We had discovered that very early in life, so going into closed places like this was only a wintertime activity. Upstairs was kind of interesting. We were both nervous that we would fall through the stairs to the floor, but it held fairly well. The floor did sink a bit in places and you could feel the entire house shift every so often. We guessed it only had at most a decade before it fell over entirely. And there were only 2 rooms upstairs. What must have been a bedroom with a small closet and another small room, the purpose of which we never discovered. Maybe a child's bedroom or a study of some kind. The floor was covered in old stains that looked like blood, but we just assumed it was decades and decades of water, mold, and other crap. There was one really odd thing that was old scars in the wood on the floor and wall in one part of the bedroom. No splinters anymore, but large hack marks, deep grooves in the wood like somebody had cut into it long ago. We joked that it was the site of an axe murder and then laughed. And Patrick and I were always thrill seekers, so we packed up the tent, gathered a firewood, and relocated back to the old house. The fireplace was stone and brick, so we figured it would be safe for a small campfire. We set up my radio, listened to music, set up a fire. Thankfully, the chimney wasn't too blocked, and we sat on the porch, smoking and drinking the few beers that we had caged. And we were both getting older and both knew that we only had a couple of years or so until one of us both moved and these trips became either rare or extinct. So we talked about that mostly. And we were off school for a few days, so we decided that we would camp in the house that night, explore a bit in the morning, and maybe go get paint and building materials out from my barn the next day. And over the next year, work on fixing the house up a bit and making it our vacation house. We were very happy with our discovery. We both crashed out fairly early, unrolling our sleeping bags and falling asleep to Pink Floyd on my old boombox. I'm not sure how long we were asleep, but I remember waking up confused and feeling immediately nervous and scared about something. Patrick was awake too. I could see that he was also feeling the same. We both woke up and started packing. We were rolling the sleeping bags up when we heard a creak from upstairs. We froze, wondering if it was more of the same stuff or if some lunatic had come in while we were sleeping and was messing with us. We started moving towards the door when we heard a loud scream from upstairs. a woman screaming and a man shouting. The man was shouting something, it sounded like English, but I didn't catch any of it. Heavily accented or just full of rage, I don't know. We heard loud banging and crashing and the scream stopped. At this point, Patrick and I were quietly trying to leave when we heard footsteps moving towards the stairs. We ran towards the door and the footsteps followed after us. We ran to the cliff face and Patrick jumped down. I tossed down the radio and he caught it. I took a look back and saw a figure in the door staring at us. All I could really see is a white face and huge dark eyes. It made a move towards us and I jumped down. We were in the boat and pushed off in record time. We never returned to our vacation house. So, I posted 9 chapters worth of incidents set out in the general area that I grew up. I'm going to post some pictures as soon as I get a few. A lot of you have requested that. I've been asked a lot about what I think it is, and I honestly do not know. I've had several theories about this over the years, and I would like to go through those and highlight a few examples of events that made me adopt that theory for a time. This post will ramble a bit, and it'll act as a sort of conclusion to the series. And today I also want to highlight several small events that I think tie things together a bit more. Sort of a putty filling in the cracks of the main stories. I would also like some feedback. It seems like there's a lot of you out there who've had experiences in the same area. It's been amazing seeing that many people from my neck of the woods. Please share your stories with me below. I would love to hear them and share any input that I would have that would be appropriate. Also, thanks for telling me about that David Pauliad's researcher. Over the past few days, I've been listening to interviews with him, and some of the information this man is sharing is insanely similar to the events that I either experienced out there or heard stories about. Aside from the possibly supernatural incidents out there, there's also a creepily high rate of violence and degradation out there. I told a story in a previous post about the man who had bought my house degenerating into a psychopath. I also mentioned the brother of my friend who went from basically petty theft into attempted murder, and how in both cases I think there were connections to the thing in the woods. My next door neighbors, the ones about halfway down the hill, I've mentioned them before. They were the drunks that went out in Saratoga, and I mentioned the lights cutting them. The dad was always a bit weird. I think over the 10 years that he lived next door, they eventually got divorced and he moved away. I never really shared any words with him. I knew my mother disliked him a great deal and had zero trust in him. She didn't like the mother either, but she was okay with me being around her. I remember when I was a kid she told me that if he ever came to pick me up from school that I was to not get in the vehicle with him. If it was just the mother, I would be okay. She didn't explain why, and it was only about a year ago that I heard the reason why. Once when I was very young, my parents were having a few drinks over at the neighbor's house, and the man got very, very drunk. He got weepy and shouty and started babbling about how he had killed a bunch of kids out in a town about 50 miles away. My dad dismissed this as crazy drunk talk, but my mother called the police in that town the next morning. She had asked about missing and murdered kids and was transferred to a senior officer who confirmed that there were a bunch of kids about that age who had either gone missing or were found murdered. She asked if they had a suspect and told the officer what the neighbor had said. The detective said yes, that they have a description of the man they are almost sure had killed them, and then they proceeded to describe a man completely different from our neighbor. My mother sighed in relief and said, "Oh, thank God, that's not this man at all." The officer asked her to describe her neighbor and she did. The officer was quiet a moment and then said, "Yeah, that's him." He had lied about the initial description to see what she would say and not influence. I'm guessing this is about the time that I stopped seeing him around. I think whatever out there causes people to go insane and violent. I'm not sure if it's just the stress of these events, or if the thing is actively screwing with their minds, or if the presence of these things just kind of causes a form of cancer. like living next to a nuclear reactor or something. Kids go missing all the time. When I was 16 and got my first car, I remember driving to school early in the morning and seeing 2 police cars and an ambulance with the lights off next to a ditch by the highway. They were pulling a kid, only a few years younger than me, out of the water. He was ripped apart. I remember his skin being blue, a bluish white. He had gone outside to take out the trash 3 weeks earlier. His house was isolated and nobody noticed anyone come or go. Just went out to the burn barrel and was never seen alive again. A kid that I knew from school was shot by his own father. A hunting accident. Shot him through the window of his own truck. A neighbor who kept hearing voices coming from the woods until he kidnapped that old woman. Also, there are a lot of deformities out there. The nearest town had a large population of people with absolutely hideous deformities. I used to joke that it was like living in H.P. Lovecraft's Dunwich. A relative had somebody break into her house once. Thankfully, she had a sibling staying over and they scared the intruder off after beating her over the head with a stick. They found a bag of equipment, sex toys, and restraints in the house. My longest running theory is that whatever is out there has been there for a long time. It's some form of local life and either doesn't have a set form or can project illusions into your mind. It would explain the skinned man in my aunt's attic, the sounds coming from outside or in the cellar, the man with the glowing green eyes, and so on. The shadow people might be projections, or they might be like avatars for it, almost like video games. But how would that explain the woods being so vast or impossible to traverse without hitting man-made landmarks like the highway? How would that explain the same mountains seen by both myself and my friends so many times over the years? Many times I've had the theory that it's a genius low-key, some form of intelligence created by the land itself, but I'm still not sure. The search and rescue poster described seeing staircases in the woods and parks. I never saw staircases, but I knew exactly what he was talking about. We found train tracks out in the woods in an area that hadn't been cleared in centuries, if ever. There was absolutely no way train tracks could be out there. No roads and no pathways and no place for them to come and go. You would hear them sometimes too. The last little bit that I'll leave you with is about one of the neighbors. He was further down the road and moving towards the highway. We always referred to him by his initials. I forgot what they were, but I'll just say JD. Again, he was a little bit slow, had a little 2-story house near one of the bridges. I don't know what he did for a living, but I remember people just described him as harmless. We would see him off and on, either driving through to or from the house or riding our bikes. He would always smile and wave. I remember that he used to use cocoa powder like a tobacco dip, and always had a bit of chocolate drool going down his chin. I was scared of him as a child. The bridge close to his house was also really creepy. The same creek that ran behind my house ran under that bridge, and it was a massively steep drop-off. 30 feet down, and the bridge was one lane with no guardrails, only 2 or 3 inch bumps. Cars went off that bridge occasionally. About once a year, some idiot would be barreling down these dark roads and take the turn too quickly, or be weaving from booze and go right over the edge head first. Usually they did not survive. JD either died or went to a state home when he was about 9 or so. Patrick, Aaron, Brad, and I used to wander around his yard occasionally. I don't remember who it was that was with me when we finally went into his house, but I won't forget what we found. There was a collection of women's jewelry, wallets, watches, and teeth up on a shelf. I don't know where he got them from, but I'm almost certain that they were taken from those crashes. I just couldn't get the image out of my head of JD sitting on his porch, a line of cocoa drool going down his face, that same goofy, cheerful smile on his face, watching a car go off the cliff and casually strolling down to pick stuff from the still alive people. I worked for a sheriff's department in East Texas for the first 2 years that I was a cop. I currently work at another department in the same area. I'm going to have to change names so I don't get into any legal trouble or upset surviving family. Also, I don't want to rustle any feathers with colleagues. The law enforcement community is very tight-knit, and egos bruise like bananas. Some of you will probably deduce what county I'm talking about from the few clues that I give you anyways. But I gotta change up the story enough for plausible deniability. You know the drill. Standard creepypasta stuff. My county was as big as Dallas or Austin County, but only has a population of 14,000 people in it. A lot of places you can only travel on foot. It's as bayou as it can get and still be in Texas. Creeks and rivers run through it like veins, proning the area to flash floods. The most common sight is tightly packed forest pushed up against blacktop roads. The most common way to die is falling asleep at the wheel or being ambushed by suicidal deer. Since there's not a lot of people and these people are poor, it means deputies are paid crap. Not that I was only in it for the pay. I loved being a cop. I pledged to be one of the good ones that stuck to his ideals and didn't become cynical. Well, I stuck to my ideals, but I became more cynical each passing day. What's worse than the pay is the safety concerns. There are only 2 deputies out on a given night, one for the south end and one for the north. This means your only backup is usually 20 to 40 minutes away from you. And if your partner is also handling an emergency, well, then you're out of luck. This made the area seem like one of the last remaining bits of the Wild West. You really had to keep your wits sharp and watch your six when all alone in the woods. As romantic as the idea was of being like Walker Texas Ranger, it almost got me killed. It was the perfect storm of circumstances. My county had suffered severe flooding the week before this story had happened. The water was going down in most parts, but some places were still flooded. Another great thing was our radios had been down all day. Someone was coming to fix them in the morning, and the rain began pouring again. The call came in around midnight about a man beating on a woman's door. The man was demanding to be let in out of the rain. The woman said that she was alone with her baby and needed a cop fast. I was in the dispatch located in the jail side of the sheriff's department when the call came in. My dispatcher, who was like a mother hen, gave me a look. I got a live one look. Her eyebrows raised as she snapped at me to get my attention. Her phone tucked to her ear while her other hand typed furiously. I listened to her repeat information out loud for me as I scribbled down the caller's address in my notepad. It was in the flash flood zone. It was passable, but the continuing storm was changing this quick. Another hour of hard rain would cut it off from the rest of the world. My dispatcher swiveled in her chair to look right at me, her face serious. Call me on your phone when you get close. The radios are still down, so I'll call you every 10 minutes for a security check. Got it, I said, as I spun around to hurry to my patrol car. I let the South End deputy know what you got in case he needs to get to you. She quipped as the heavy door to the jail slammed behind me. I appreciated the gesture from her, but having backup almost an hour away didn't mean much if things popped off. Backup could be coming from the moon for all the difference it made. I squeezed myself into the crowded front seat of my patrol vehicle. I hadn't even entered the address into my onboard GPS when my phone had started ringing. It was dispatch. What you got?" I asked. There was an unusual pause before she spoke. I could hear the concern in her voice. "Hey, just learned this. Our caller said that it may be Ezekiel Burrows out there." I paused before turning the key in the ignition. This was not good. I had dealt with Zeke before. It was back when I was a rookie. I'll have to put this story on hold to fill you in with a flashback episode first. I had been working for about 2 weeks at the time. I was still riding shotgun with my FTO. An anonymous caller rang the sheriff's department complaining that Zeke and his older brother were driving around pointing guns at people and firing into the air. My FTO had been a stereotype of an old county cop who was about to retire. He was laid back and calmly gave instructions between drags of a cigarette. He wore a bushy white walrus mustache and cowboy hat that fitted him perfectly. When the call came across the car radio, his demeanor flipped like a switch. He sat forward and flicked his cigarette out the window. His face darkened. "Alright, deputy, this could get dangerous. Stay alert, stay close, and do everything that I tell you." We were burning towards the call pretty fast when he offered this additional piece of information. "I know these two brothers, they've been known to fight with police. Don't be afraid to go hands-on if you need to," he said with his slow demeanor. And my body dumped a ton of adrenaline for a fight-or-flight response as I felt my stomach turn. I was glad that my FTO was so calm for me. In those days, I used to be ashamed of the butterflies in my stomach. I thought it meant that I was weak or a coward. Now I realize it's my body's way of protecting itself and I needed to embrace the feeling. We found the brothers slow rolling around in a Hutter green Dodge Neon. It was missing a driver's side mirror and had a giant hole where a red brake light should be. It was great when they made our job easy. We initiated a felony takedown. That's pretty much when you point your weapon at the suspect vehicle while standing behind your open car door. You give loud, verbal commands like, "Driver, step out of the vehicle slowly." Anyway, we had both of them pulled out and detained in handcuffs. Nothing of note really happened except for there being 2 shotguns and 3 rifles in the back seat. Ammo and shell casings everywhere. It's not illegal in the state of Texas, but highly suspicious. The original caller wanted to remain anonymous, so we had nothing to prove that they were firing from the vehicle. My FTO dealt with Zeke's older brother while I talked with Zeke. I can't remember the brother's name. We would just call him Turd for now. My FTO had our dispatch run both of their names to see if they had any active warrants. So we got some tense and awkward minutes with the brothers while they waited to see if they were going to jail or not. Turd ran at the mouth for the duration of the stop, called us every racist and vulgar thing in his extensive vocabulary of no-no words. Me, being a rookie, got a little flustered at some of the things he had allegedly done to my mother, so I turned my attention to Zeke. Zeke stood there downcast and drenched in sweat. It was only 80 degrees, but he looked like he was about to suffer a heat stroke. His whole body began to tremble slightly and sway back and forth. "You okay, Zeke?" I asked as I stepped closer to him. I thought that I might have had to catch him if he passed out on me. You see, Zeke smelled like hot garbage and it was pretty overpowering, a mixture of sweat and butt. I didn't want to touch him, but he was cuffed behind his back. I couldn't let him tip over with nothing but his head to break the fall. Lucky for me, Zeke straightened up when I reached for him. His eyes bulged as he looked right at me, his teeth bared in a grimace. "Is this one gonna kill me, Jesus?" he whispered in a raspy voice, his vacant eyes locked with mine. "Oh no, Zeke, you're just being detained while we check if it's good to let you and your brother go," I said while trying to hide how creeped out I was. Zeke paused and tilted his head to the side slightly. A smirk touched the edge of his mouth as he nodded like he was in agreement with something. The next thing that he said was something really strange. It's been a while since that day, so my memory is foggy, but I remember it being something like, "I'm supposed to tell you to remember my face during the massacre." "What?" I said as I turned to face him squarely. His brother must have heard the change in my tone of voice. He leaned over to yell past my FTO. "Hey, keep your mouth shut, Zeke. Let me handle these pigs." Zeke considered his brother calmly and replied, "You will be alone when you die, brother." Turd's eyes widened and I saw pure fear flash across his face. He scoffed and tried to play it off by laughing, but I could see through his bravado. His brother had scared him. Long story short, both brothers came back clear of warrants. The original 911 caller still wanted to remain anonymous, and this meant that we had no witness to any alleged illegal activity. With nothing to hold them for, we let them loose. But I do remember one more creepy thing that Zeke said. When they were uncuffed, the two walked back to their car. Turd went for the driver's seat and Zeke went to sit in the seat behind him. "What, I'm your chauffeur now?" Turd asked angrily. Zeke was staring at something in the passenger seat while shaking his head slowly. "No," Zeke replied coolly. "He's already sitting there. I'm not gonna make him mad. He's already been staring at you all day." And Turd said something muffled to Zeke and got into the driver's seat. As they drove away, I could see Zeke sitting in the back, half turned and pointing at something beside his brother in the passenger seat. And before they had pulled out of earshot, I could hear Turd begin to scream profanities at his brother. So, that's the previously on the TV show of my life. That was my first run-in with Zeke, and now it seemed that I was racing to him again years later. Zeke's little origin story always sat different with me. I never encountered him in person after that initial contact, but word of his exploits would always reach me. An elderly woman had her door kicked in by the two brothers. She was beaten and robbed. Didn't call the cops until a week later because her grandson made her. She was too terrified to give a witness statement, but the grandson told me the entire street knew that it was Zeke and Turd. An outdoor birthday party canceled when Zeke popped up out of the woods and started firing his shotgun in the air. I spent the rest of the night trying to reel in trigger-happy relatives looking for Zeke in the woods. A caller that we 90% knew was Zeke kept calling dispatch and threatening to kill the sheriff on recorded lines. He was mad that his brother was arrested. Problem was, Turd was arrested by a neighboring county, not us. It was evident that Zeke was sliding further and farther to the dark side. He was the Riddler to my Batman. I could never catch up with him, he just left problems for me to deal with. But now maybe I had him, and I could physically put cuffs on him. My GPS said that I was 10 minutes out from the caller's house. It was going to be a little bit longer because of the downpour. Visibility was low and I could feel my ride trying to hydroplane a few times. When I was about 2 minutes out, the road before me just seemed to disappear. The white lines just vanished as water flooded the road. Turning on my takedown lights didn't reveal where the high water ended, so I stepped out of my car to take a better look. In the darkness, all I could hear was the sporadic thumping of droplets hitting my raincoat, and the mechanical back and forth of my wipers in overdrive. Before me was a flat plane of water rippling from millions of raindrops. Every few seconds the area would illuminate with lightning, showing me the deep water continued around the bend in the road. My mind went back to the PS1 days of Silent Hill. First thing I did as a terrified 5th grader was try to leave the town, only to find an endless drop-off into the dense fog. I had the similar feeling of dread now, but this time it was an impromptu lake and not a cliff, and I was running towards the danger, not away from it. I was weighing my options and considering letting dispatch know that it was impassable. I was in a Charger, not a Tahoe. Maybe Zeke found somewhere else to stay dry. I mean, he hasn't broken any laws yet. My phone began to ring. It was dispatch. Before I could even say hello, I was met with, "You there yet, deputy?" "I'm around the corner, there's." "He's back," my dispatcher half shouted. "She's saying that he's kicking the door and beating on windows. I can hear him threatening to hurt her in the background." At this moment, only one course of action was clear. I guess I'd be swimming if I had to. I slowly but steadily submerged my vehicle into the dark waters. I was praying that it wouldn't drown out as the waters rose to about 2 feet high around me. Water began seeping in from the bottoms of the doors as I made the bend in the road. I could see land before me as I began to get more traction and pull out of the water. I gassed my vehicle to give it one last lurch to exit the water and spin out into the muddy road. I hit the brakes to get a quick layout of my surroundings. The red stop sign of a four-way intersection reflected back at me. I was now in a small residential community. My GPS told me that the caller's house was across the intersection and 3 houses down on the left. It was hard to see it through the downpour, but I could see the road disappeared under the water again. I got out and began to walk. I wasn't going to risk getting my car stuck and trapped in the driveway. As I sloshed forward, tension began to build in the back of my neck. Silent lightning would periodically illuminate me in a sea of ripples. A cold feeling surrounded my thoughts. A black hole opened in my stomach, sucking all confidence from me. This was new. I had been scared before, but fight or flight always set in with a burst of nervous energy. But this was surreal. I felt like I was dreaming. I felt dread. I felt alone. I was in water up to my knees when I reached the yard. I finally got some higher ground the closer that I came to the front door. I squished around to my left and my right, checking the sides of the house. The house was a double-sized trailer elevated 3 feet off the ground on stilts. I had to walk up the steep stairs to knock on the door. "Sheriff's Department," I yelled over the rain. I jumped back down with a splash of the narrow steps and I scanned the darkness. I heard rumbling at the door as it opened a couple of inches. I could see a feminine face peeking out at me. "Can I see a badge or something?" came a fearful voice. I cocked my head at this before I realized that I was completely covered in my yellow CIAHerp raincoat. I unbuttoned my trench coat and showed my flashlight on my badge and duty belt. "He was here just now," she said nervously. Her eyes darted back and forth, scanning the darkness. I could hear the frantic cries of her child from deeper in the house. "Lock the door, but stay by it for me. I'll check around back. So don't worry if you hear me making noise back there." I waited until I heard her lock the door before pulling out my gun and circling around to the left. I circled around the entire house slowly, making the corners with a deliberate slowness. My small but powerful flashlight held at the center of my chest with my gun at low ready. The entire perimeter of the house checked clear. My head was on a swivel, checking the thick forest pushing in from the darkness. I even checked her small car, pulled on the doors to see if they were left unlocked. There was nothing suspicious. He was gone. But I felt eyes on me. The cold dread sat heavy in my stomach, making me slightly nauseous. I could feel the nervous tingle at the base of my skull, making me want to turn my head frequently. And then the obvious realization hit me, causing an extra punch to the gut. He was under the house. It was 3 feet off the ground. Me being an idiot had just been walking around him. I was standing with my back a foot away from the house. I immediately dropped to one knee with a splash and twist to aim my weapon and light under the house, my mind half expecting the jump scare from Zeke, akin to the scene where they first showed the xenomorph in the vents on Alien. My fingers slowly loosens off the trigger as I saw nothing but interlocking planks of wood, cobwebs, and more darkness. I couldn't see fully under the house because it had been used to store old junk like a lawnmower, sandbags, and old bicycles. I stared intently for a while, trying to make out a human form. Every time I moved the blinding beam of light, it caused dark shadows to dance underneath, mimicking movement. I wasn't satisfied that he wasn't under there, but I couldn't see a thing. I backed away from the house and began to think. He was close by and he was probably watching me. I comforted myself with the realization that he was scared of me, and I had a captive audience. He was either under the house or waiting in the forest, trying not to make a sound by running. "Zeke," I projected my voice with as much authority as I could. "This is the Sheriff Department. We know it's you out there." I did a 360 scan around me with my flashlight as I slowly continued. "You haven't broken any laws yet. Go home now and that can be the end of it. If I have to come back, you are definitely going to jail, I promise you that." As I finished my speech, I let the silence hang in the air for a dramatic effect. Thunder rolled in the distance to punctuate my seriousness. Feeling confident in my ultimatum, I sloshed my way back to my patrol car, but don't get me twisted, dear listener. I'm not inept or cowardly. I had a plan and leaving was a ruse. When I got to my car, I called dispatch to tell her the plan. I told her to let our caller know that I was going to drive back to the stop sign down the road and dark out to wait for Zeke to return. Soon I was back in my car with all the lights out, staring down the dark road towards the house. As I sat in the darkness listening to the chaotic storm envelop me, I checked my phone. Only 10 minutes had passed when I swear it had been an eternity. The strange dreamlike feeling flooded over me again. I had a quick thought telling me that I had never gone to the house in the first place. I had been just sitting here imagining the whole series of events that had just happened. Unsure, I patted my ankles to see if they were still wet. They weren't. I never trudged in the water to check on the scared mother, but I had remembered doing it. I don't know, things are so foggy. I had the sudden urge to cry and I didn't know why. I just felt so scared, so alone. Nothing made sense. I fought back a sob. A harsh voice spoke to me, cutting through my confusion like a poisoned knife through my brain. It said that I should just end it. I should just use the tool holstered on my hip. I put my head against the coolness of my window. Hot tears ran down my face as my hand fumbled with the retention locks on my holster. The coolness of the window was my only relief before the end. Good thing it was snowing. The snow always made me sad as it formed a white coat of ice on my windows. Wait a minute, snow? In Texas? I jolted with a gasp in my seat as if waking from a dream. Maybe I was, a micro-dream. I had had a couple of those in Marine boot camp due to sleep deprivation. But why had it happened now? I shook my head vigorously to get my bearing back. The dark thoughts fled from me. I realized the power on the street must have gone out while I was in my reverie, because no light was coming from any of the houses. Visibility was zero and the storm was at a deafening cacophony by now. Alone with just my thoughts in the darkness, I doubted my plan. I had had enough of my mind playing tricks on me, and I wondered how long I should sit here like a creeper until I had to go back to regular patrol. My phone lit up and I jumped to answer it before it could even ring. I immediately recognized my dispatcher's voice, but it sounded too far away. "He's back, right now he..." Her voice cut out as the call dropped and it chimed in my ear. Yeah, sometimes these cell towers out here were spotty, especially during storms. Now I had a useless phone that I couldn't call backup with. My only hope was my dispatcher would get my partner rolling my way. He was around 30 minutes to an hour away, remember? As I slammed my door behind me and began slogging through the rain, I thought to myself, on nights like this, I knew the future. I could just imagine the darkest timeline of events and it would happen. The thought of my cell phone crapping out had been a whisper in my mind since the night began. I didn't bring it to the forefront of my thoughts in hope that it wouldn't manifest, but it came true along with all the other bad vibes of the night. I prayed and no more latent fears came to fruition, especially the deepest fear that we all suppressed every time we wear a badge. I was splashing through the mini ocean leading up the front porch when I heard the screaming of the child. Not the normal screaming of a fussy infant, but a sharp, raspy scream, as if the child's throat was hurting from the exertion. Out came my gun again as I quickly ran towards these steep stairs. I did a quick duck under to scan the house with my light before I positioned myself beside the narrow stairs. I didn't go up them due to hearing about cops being shot off porches through closed doors as soon as they had announced themselves. I banged down the lower part of the door with a fist and announced myself. I waited a beat for an answer or a gunshot. None came though, and I weighed my options. I didn't have consent or a search warrant, but what I did have was a good old exigent circumstance. Exigent circumstance is what firefighters use to kick your door in when they smell smoke. As long as I believe danger is on the other side of the door, I can ram it in. The baby's screams became choking coughs, and I heard something thump loudly inside. I hopped up the steps and prepared to launch my shoulder into the door. A tiny voice in my head urged me to see if the door was unlocked. It should still be locked from last time, but I tried it anyways. It opened a crack and I was hit with an awful stench. The closest thing that I can compare it to is somebody with a severe sinus infection waking up with morning breath, having eaten rotten eggs and they blew in your face. I pulled my head back to see a bulging eye staring at me from the top corner of the door. But this eye reflected like a cat's or a raccoon. It stared down at me with a dotted purple. In the split second before I kicked the door open, I could see the eye glint purple and retreat. I could hear the growl of a dog as the door swung open to the darkness within. My flashlight and my weapon swung around frantically, searching for a dog or a tall intruder with purple eyes. I saw nothing but a small living room. A TV to my right, a couch to my left. Counter in front of me separating the living room from the kitchen. I could hear the child screaming and coughing from the hallway to my left. I took a couple of tentative steps towards the cries when a figure rushed out of the hallway towards me. I let out a yell and leveled my Glock to fire. I thank God that I froze for an instant instead of shooting reflexively. In the split second that followed, I saw the mother with her head tilted sideways and her eyes rolled back. Her arms were trailing limply behind her as she fell. I sidestepped out of her way and she crumpled to the floor beside me with a thud. Hindsight 2020, maybe I should have caught her, but maybe part of me knew that she had been thrown, so I kept my weapon aimed down the hallway. Or that's what I tell myself anyways. The hallway was only 6 feet long, a bedroom to the right and left with a bathroom in the middle. I had been in countless trailers with this layout. The bathroom door was closed, so whoever threw her could be to the right or to the left taking cover. I could see that both of the doors were open. I spared a glance down at the woman and she was on her side facing me. Young and attractive, she was only in a light shirt and underwear. Her eyes were open and she was breathing in quick and short bursts. Her eyes had a trance-like stare and I could see her skin glistened with a layer of sweat. I couldn't see blood or physical injuries on her, but she reminded me of a fish taken out of water, slowly dying. When I returned my gaze to the hallway, my brain couldn't make sense of what I was seeing. It appeared the hallway had gotten longer. Where my flashlight had once illuminated the bathroom door, now there was only pitch blackness. I moved my flashlight back and forth to reveal the darkness was a fixed object, like a cloud at the lip of the doorway. Even as I squinted and tried to grasp what I was seeing, the darkness had seemed to grow closer. It leaked out like a fog into the living room. The door frame faded to blackness and then the walls around it, and then parts of the couch beside it. The best way that I can explain is that it looked like the world in front of me was disappearing, being swallowed up by the void. The dark reached across the room to flood after me. I looked down to see the world drop off into nothingness about a foot away from me. The bare legs of the woman laying beside me had already been consumed by it. I tried in vain to wave the darkness away with my light, but to no avail. I backed into the TV and knocked it over. The familiar panic began to boil over within me as the dark whispers tore through my mind again. It was the same despair that I had felt in the care. I wasn't afraid of dying on the job, but this wasn't different. What was this darkness? What unimaginable terror waited for me in the approaching void? Would it take me to hell? If I died here, would God even see me? The darkness was right out of arm's reach when the glow of my flashlight was snuffed out and I was plunged into absolute darkness. My last light of hope disappearing caused a primal scream to build up in my throat. One last terrified plea before the madness overtook me. Oh God, oh Jesus. I blinked rapidly as my flashlight sprung back to life, illuminating the room around me. The unnatural darkness had retreated. I blinked repeatedly as the horrid thoughts flew from me, leaving me shaking and whimpering. I fought the urge to run out of the door and forget stupid ideas like honor and duty. As I supported myself against the TV leaning against the wall, I began to catch my breath. I did a couple rounds of combat breathing to lower my racing heart. I also let out a curse word every other exhale. I had a job to do, and I knew that I had to replace paralyzing fear with something else. Life had taught me anger could override fear and push you past exhaustion in a pinch. I also steadied myself with a mental checklist. I would finish this call, I would find the baby, call an ambulance for the mom, and stop Zeke, or whatever it was out here. And then I could go 10-8 and drink coffee at the office and everything would be like normal. I knelt down to check on the mother. She wouldn't respond to anything that I asked her. Her pupils were as big as saucers and showed no reaction to my light. A brief pat-down revealed no apparent injuries. But then I heard it again, the soft cry of an infant. But it wasn't coming from the hallway, it sounded closer. I shot up and immediately saw a figure to the right of my periphery. I twirled to highlight a dark figure of a person standing in the kitchen. The figure's back was turned to me with shoulders hunched. It wore a ratty black raincoat, torn and frayed. "Let me see your hands," I yelled. The figure didn't budge. I could hear him mumbling as he bobbed his shoulder. "Hey, listen to me, I swear to God I'll shoot you. Hands up and turn around slowly." I could hear him start softly cooing. "But my hands are full, deputy," he croaked as he slowly turned around. It was Zeke and he was cradling the baby in his arms. My whole body tensed up at this sight. The child couldn't have been more than a year old. I could see the child moving its arms and wriggling about. Thank God for that. But Zeke's grip was firmly around the base of its skull. His disgusting hand palming its delicate head like he was holding a baseball. The dirty nail of his pointer finger gently tapping the child's nose. I mentally weighed my options. Seeing Zeke holding the child reminded me of how terrified I felt when I first held my newborn nephew. He was so fragile, I thought that I could crush him on accident. I knew Zeke was playing upon that fear to keep me at bay. I could shoot him in the face. It wouldn't be the hardest shot to make. He was not but 7 feet from me, but he would drop the baby. As if sensing my thoughts, Zeke let go of the child's head and it dangled upside down by the leg. Now the child commenced the screaming as it swung back and forth like a pendulum. Zeke outstretched his arm, presenting the baby to me, purposefully holding the baby directly in front of the muzzle of my gun. "Take the shot, kill the bad guy, save the family," Zeke hissed. "It's what you trained for all these years," he continued as he took a step towards me, shortening the distance to about 4 feet. I could see the tears pouring out of the child's chubby face, running down its forehead to sprinkle to the floor. I pulled my gun away from the child and held it close to my chest, terrified to have something so dangerous so close to something so precious. I took a half step back when I realized that I was losing my one advantage. Zeke thought that I had tunnel vision on shooting him. He expected me to step back and keep my distance like cops were trained to do, but I always liked a good fight. I quickly came up with a plan to holster my weapon while rushing him. I would grab the baby with my offhand while giving him a low kick right to the knee. I would catch him off guard by springing my attack in the middle of telling him something that everybody knew. "Zeke, listen to me, you have the right to remain silent." My gun started to lower to my holster, my offhand pointing the light in his eyes. "Anything you say can be used against you." A grin began to widen on Zeke's face. "If you cannot afford a..." I tensed to attack. Zeke whipped the baby into the air. Time slowed around me as I saw the child arch upwards to almost hit the ceiling. I must have instinctively dropped my weapon in light as my arms reached to catch the child as it descended. My hands searched the darkness where my brain predicted the falling child should be. I felt its soft body and eagerly pulled the child to my chest. The instant that my brain confirmed that I had secured the infant, My eyesight exploded with stars as my head rocked back. While reeling backwards, another blow hit the side of my right knee. I buckled and fell to my back, the gear in my duty belt jamming painfully into me. The entire time my arms desperately wrapped around the screaming child. I immediately began frantically searching the ground around me with my right hand. I couldn't let Zeke get my weapon. I began to sit up and roll to my side in a desperate attempt to shield the baby. I received a crushing knee to the belly as Zeke landed on me with all his weight. I let out a grunt of pain and wrapped the child tighter to my chest. He straddled me and pulled himself closer by the collar of my overvest. I could smell his telltale stench cascading off me, his enlarged eyes staring into mine. I realized with horror that Zeke had no intention of going for my gun. With a crazed smile on his face, he embraced me in a hug and began to squeeze. He was going to squeeze me to squeeze the life out of the baby. I had to recall my surging right hand to push back against Zeke. We struggled like that for what seemed like an eternity. He was mounted on top of me, giving me a bear hug, and I desperately tried pushing him away with my right hand while shielding the baby with my left. I knew the amount of force that he was putting on me was unnatural. He was wiry and about 6 inches shorter than me. I had at least 40 pounds on the guy and I was in decent shape. But I felt my back crack as I gasped as my muscles were quickly pushed to the point of muscle failure. The poor child began to wheeze as our bodies sandwiched him. I was getting desperate and my mind brought up a memory that I had tucked away for a rainy day, hoping that I never had to use it. I remembered a salty former devil dog SWAT instructor teaching us room clearing tactics in the academy. It was the end of the day and he began to share war stories about his time in the Corps. Most people don't know the quickest way to kill somebody is putting your thumb right through the bad guy's eye socket, he had told us with a wicked smile, mimicking the action by thrusting his gnarled thumb with a quick jab. Straight into the brain, he finished as he twisted his thumb and made a squish sound with his mouth. Yeah, my body cringed, just like yours did as I heard this. He must have seen the group of us cadets physically withdraw and continued. The trick is getting your brain to override your sense of basic human decency and kill another human in this horrific way. Your mind will fight you on it. It's not natural to want to do this to your fellow man. Even now that you know it, you won't be able to do it if the time comes. I was used to the mind games and hazing from alpha military types, trying to scare us into quitting. I thought on what he said that day, unsure if I could kill or maim someone in such a horrible way. I would have to exhaust all other options. But now as I lay on my back, my body failing and a child being crushed between us, I had to dig deep to survive. Zeke blinked for the first time during this whole confrontation. A look of realization had passed over him. He grinned even wider and began to chuckle. He released me from his hug and quickly grabbed my head with both hands, his thumbs moving from my eyes. I closed my eyes as I felt his dirty thumbnail scrape across my eyelids. Panic leapt inside me as I realized what he was doing. Even though my eyes were closed, I had a mental picture where he was. My right hand struck out and my thumb pierced through something smooth and soft. Warm liquid immediately engulfed my hand and splashed across my face. I didn't realize I was screaming until the copper-tasting liquid had poured into my mouth. I could taste what it was and I knew what I had done, but I had to open my eyes to see. Zeke's grip had slackened enough to open my eyes to peek at the damage. Sure enough, my thumb was deeply embedded into Zeke's left eye socket. He still grinned maniacally as the blood oozed out of him. I pushed him up and away from me as I bucked and twisted frantically. He finally rolled off to my left and my thumb came free of his eye socket. I heard him kicking and thumping away from me as he retreated into the darkness. I sat up with the child and quickly searched to my right for my gun. I found it quickly and snatched it up and scanned the room. I didn't see Zeke, but I scanned back and forth repeatedly. The child resumed its deafening scream and I could feel my heart pounding through my entire body. After a couple of moments of pointing my weapon at the dark and cradling the child, my mind began to work again. I noticed how strange my weapon felt in my blood-covered hand. I noticed the screaming baby sounded loud and healthy, and I noticed that we were both alone. Alone. The child's mother was missing. I sat there overwhelmed, but first things first, I had to deal with the infant in my arms. Retrieving my light, I slowly stood and searched the room for a safe place to lay my screaming bundle. I settled with placing the baby on the floor and building up a pillow fort around it with throw pillows. I could feel precious seconds being wasted. As much as I had wanted to stay with the baby, the longer that Zeke was alone with the mother, the worse. With trepidation, I stood to face the hallway. Zeke must have taken her back there. I stepped forward, deciding on the door to my right first. My kick blasted the door open as my light flooded the room. It revealed a woman's bedroom that had been completely trashed. It looked like an explosion had occurred from a large hole in the center of the room. Wooden torn carpet was scattered all across the area. The flooring was bent up and outwards like something had come up through from the bottom. I leaned over the hole to see down into the muddy ground beneath. Is this how Zeke got in? It looked like the Hulk had smashed his way up through the floor. Any other time I wouldn't believe it, but sanity had left the moment that I was dispatched to this house. I knew that he could still be down there with her. If I had crawled down there, I would be putting myself in dangerously tight corridors with Zeke again. I didn't want another wrestling rematch with his freakish strength. A bolt of lightning crashed somewhere close, the bright strobe outlining a tall figure outside the bedroom window. I looked up to only catch a glimpse of it before it vanished, but it was an imposing humanoid figure of blackness with purple reflecting eyes. It must have been 10 feet tall, pressing its hands and face against the other side of the glass. As quickly as I saw it, it winked out of existence, only the after image of it in my mind. I shuffled around the hole to look out the window. Standing further out in the backyard was a group of shadows. I didn't have to wait long for another lightning strike to illuminate the night. What the light exposed hardly surprised me, but it made me shudder anyways. It was Zeke, soaking in the rain, his outstretched arm holding the mother up by the back of her neck to face me. The unnatural ease in which he held her outwards was as effortless as he had held the baby. It was as if he was presenting her to me. A twisted grin dominated his bloodied, one-eyed face as she hung limply. He beckoned me with his free hand to come before turning curtly and strolling for the woods with her. I spat a curse at him as he faded into the trees. I had to get her back. I could care less if he got away in the end, but I couldn't live with my final memory of her being taken by that grinning cyclops. He had sought her out this night. I had to stop whatever morbid plans that he had for her. I ran back into the kitchen and located the back door. I flew out into the cold rain, jumping down the slick steps and sprinting towards the woods. I could see where the foliage parted to make a small pathway. This was around the place that I had last spotted Zeke. He must have taken it. Once I hit the tree line, my momentum almost came to a stop. The water sloshed up to my knees as I took heavy steps forward. After trudging a few yards into the woods, I spotted a glimpse of movement pulling away from me. Every time that I thought that I lost Zeke's trail, I would see him slipping further into the darkness, dragging that poor woman with him. My legs burned as I forced myself forward through the deep foliage. I tried to keep Zeke in my sights through blinding trees and vines. I don't know how long I chased after him. Time did its weird thing again. I fell into a fugue state of desperation and exhaustion. All I knew is that I had to keep moving forward. Though I was surrounded by a thick forest, I felt isolated, like I was floating in the void of space, or standing at the edge of a great chasm. The darkness outside the reach of my light was a void into nothing. It seemed that only the immediate area where I stood was solid. The only things tangible around me were the figures that my light discovered. As soon as I moved past the ground that I stood on or my light passed by the surroundings, the matter returned to nothing. I could fall into the abyss and never be heard from again, another soul lost to the forest. How long would it take before people noticed that I was missing? Maybe it would be deemed important enough for a small local news report. My sheriff might call in reserves and troopers to have the woods searched for me. But after a couple of weeks it would be called off. It's too expensive to keep it up. I know because I've seen it happen a couple of times. I would just be gone. No one would really know that I had been swallowed up by despair, that I had glitched out of this reality to be forever falling into darkness. In my grim reverie of stalking after Zeke, I was vaguely aware of something shadowing me. From my peripherals, I would catch the dark figure with purple eyes keeping pace with me. I could smell the stink of BO and bad breath wafting around me. I wanted to turn my head and face the creature directly, but I was too afraid to lose track of Zeke. He was pulling further and further away from me as my body screamed to rest. Zeke disappeared through some shrubbery and I yelled in frustration as I urged myself to speed up. The corners of my vision faded and I knew that I was on the verge of passing out, on the cusp of falling into the water in exhaustion. I broke through the shrubs and entered a clearing. I looked around in wonder. A perfect circle with a 30-yard diameter. In the middle of the clearing stood an old tree stump jutting 3 feet out of the water. I could see a small sapling shooting out of the dead tree, its skinny branches reaching about 15 feet above the water. With a flash of lightning, I noticed Zeke standing next to the tree, holding the slumping woman by the collar. He had his hand reached up playing with something swinging from the tree. As I stumbled over, I could see that it was a noose. "Something old for something new," Zeke proclaimed loudly, still focused on the noose. "This is what my Jesus demands." The way that he said "my Jesus" made it clear that it wasn't the Jesus that Joel Osteen was peddling. He finally turned to face me. With an effortless and fluid motion, he hoisted the limp woman atop the stump. "It's gotta be something sweet," he says. And then Zeke groaned, his one eye throwing daggers at me. "Maybe it can be you, let's see what he says. But someone hangs from the tree. But I want you and the baby are just a bonus. After the massacre, I'll return to stomp the life out of the child." I had had about enough of this cryptic voodoo talk and threats. I knew that I couldn't take him hand to hand, but now he couldn't use the woman as a shield. I leveled my pistol and fired 2 quick bursts. My ears rang after the shots. The smell of gunpowder enveloped me. 2 sporadic sounds of bloop bloop as the casings hit the water. I had closed the gap between us to about 5 yards, an easy shot. So why didn't Zeke go down? Not even a flinch. I figured excitement and heart rate had made me miss. In anger, I squeezed off 5 more rounds while marching towards him. It felt like I was shooting through a shadow. He just stared at me with his cyclops eye. When I came to about 7 feet, I stopped. We stared at each other for a while, him glaring while I breathed raggedly. The only movement was the downpour around us. I knew that I was out of options. It began to dawn on me that I was going to die out here with the girl. We both were. I couldn't save her. I had chosen to chase this possessed man to the place that I would never return. A willing sacrifice. A mental picture flashed through my head. I would be laid out on the tree stump like a tribute on an altar, while the woman hung lifeless from the branch above me. Zeke smiled at me and gave a short laugh. He stretched his arms out wide as if welcoming me for a hug. And that's when I saw it. No more hiding in the corners of my vision. It revealed itself to me. A tall figure peeked out from the hangman tree behind Zeke, its purple eyes glinting. I saw it as clearly as I ever could. The inky black profile of a humanoid standing 3 feet taller than Zeke. It was made out of some unnatural blackness that had almost consumed me back in the house. My light was useless at dispersing it. It stretched out his unnaturally long hand to lay it atop Zeke's head. Zeke closed his remaining eye and began to quiver, shaking like a Holy Ghost televangelist. "No, deputy," Zeke spoke in a throaty cackle. He jerked his head from side to side, the entity never releasing its grip. Zeke gave a terrible cough and heaved his chest like he was about to throw up. It was as if his body was trying to reject the monster leeching off of him. "My Jesus has made a decision. He wants the woman. She has a sweetness most deserving defilement, a kindness to rip and tear. Her desecration will be an agony felt most by those who love her. In return, I receive his gifts, the fruits of the Spirit." Once again, I felt the world around me fall out of focus. Some dark magic was pulling me under a trance. The veil of reality thinned and the cold darkness waited for my soul to fall in. I was so tired, why fight it? I lazily put my gun back in its holster and nonchalantly dropped my light into the water. I felt the cold creep up my body like terrible claws. The unnatural cold took over my body, and I realized that I couldn't move. Or I didn't want to move. It didn't matter. I realized that the rain had stopped, turned off like a switch. I moved my eyes around in my frozen head to see millions of droplets frozen in the air. It was as if time had stopped and the rain was suspended like little planets floating against a dark galaxy. Zeke looked up and marveled at the sight. The dark entity moved out from behind the tree. My eyes were adjusted enough to the moonlight and the clearing to see the inky black mass getting closer. Panic rose within me. I didn't want the thing to get any closer to touch me. I just knew that if it touched me, it would be the most violating thing ever. But I still didn't move. I was useless to resist. The darkness was inevitable. It lowered itself in front of me, its glinter saucer eyes staring into mine. And of course, the overwhelming smell followed. It reached out a pitch-black hand to lay on top of my head. When it touched, a jolt of energy shot through me. I could feel its hate and its disgust towards me. But it wasn't just me, it was everything, even Zeke. Zeke was just a means to an end. A plaything used to spread wrath and hurt to others. But then the real event started. As I stood there dumbstruck, it showed me things. I saw the woman standing and it told me her name was Alyssa. She wore the same blank look that I had. And then realization flooded back into her face. She blinked rapidly and began to whimper. She made eye contact with Zeke, me, and the dark figure. Her eyes bulged as if pleading for escape. What followed I'm not sure of. Time was hard to measure, but it felt like an eternity. I don't know if it was real or a trance. Maybe it was a little bit of both. Both of us locked away in a crack of reality, a crack that let the darkness in to infect and corrupt. I stood motionless with tears streaming down my face as they tortured Alyssa in front of me. Zeke ravaged her in countless ways with the entity hovering closely over his shoulder. Knives and cutting instruments would be handed to him out of the dark mass of the thing. They committed acts of violence that I'll never repeat, never write, but I could see that Alyssa felt it all. She would scream through gritted teeth, her eyes bulging so much it seemed as if they would pop out. At the end, she would always end up hanging from the noose. In a display of sadism, she would be granted the use of her desecrated body. She would thrash around and weakly try to free herself from the rope around her neck, but she never got free. But right before she stopped struggling, the scene would reset, jump back in time. She would be completely healed and standing in the water, trapped in her own body, waiting for the ritual to begin again. I don't know how long it went on, maybe hours, maybe days. Time had no meaning. As the macabre show played out on repeat again and again, I began to lose hope, just as assuredly as Alyssa must have. I had given up, I had failed. I was a fool and deserved this cruel fate. I maybe even deserved worse. I deserved worse. It was this self-defeating statement that turned out to be my salvation, the lifeline to pull me out of the bottomless pit that I was sinking. But at first it was just another arrow to my heart, another stone tied to my feet. I did deserve worse, but it should be me up there. I had taken the job to help people like her. How I had failed, standing on the sidelines watching this mother be attacked on repeat. I had no kids, I was just a single and useless man. Nobody would miss me, not like her. I should take her place. This thought sparked through my mind like lightning. It was my job to stand in front of the innocent when the wolf came. Zeke spoke of sacrifice, that I should take her place. Maybe find some semblance of honor for my pathetic actions. I felt a warmth that began to grow inside of me. Zeke had cut her hundreds of times and now led her to a step on the stump so that he could put the rope around her neck. I didn't know what was happening at the time. My brain was still caught in a feverish cycle of self-hate, wanting to take her place, hating that it was her instead of me. I began to regain control of my body. I moved sluggishly towards Zeke, but he was too preoccupied. I saw the entity spin around to face me, its eyes somehow bigger. It let out a deep growl that reverberated in my brain, but it did not attack. Zeke had fastened the rope around Elisa's neck and stepped down to admire his work. Elisa let out an audible whimper as tears flooded her eyes. She knew what was coming. Maybe she prayed she would be allowed to die this time. "Jump," Zeke said, grinning through his teeth. She stepped off the stump and began to choke, her legs kicking slightly as she swung back and forth. I noticed that she didn't even attempt to remove the noose. She had given up. "No!" I screamed as I shouldered past Zeke. He reeled back in surprise. I ran up and grabbed Elisa's legs and lifted, taking the strain off of her neck. "Let me do it, it needs to be me, not her, not her!" I screamed with insane fervor. It took Elisa a moment to realize that I had finally come to her aid. I was screaming for her to take off the noose. She began squirming and pulling at the rope around her neck. I lifted her up further and stabilized her enough to remove the rope and topple us both over into the water. The cold water completely knocked my body out of its sluggish stupor, but my mind was still all haywire. I pulled Elisa out of the water and leaned her against the tree trunk. She stared back at me and began screaming as she wrapped her arms around me. She hid her face in my chest and refused to look up at the monsters. I could feel her body quivering against mine as she continued to let out muffled screams. I tried to turn to face Zeke, but Elisa held me too tight. So I just looked over my shoulder. I noticed that it was raining again and time was unfrozen. "No, take me instead," I pleaded. "She has had enough, she's done. I'm a willing sacrifice, let her sins be mine." I don't know where that last sentence came from. Divine intervention, I don't know. My mind was still in a tailspin of misery. All I know is the entity didn't like it. I heard a loud and unnatural yell. A bark, a growl maybe. The closest thing that I can compare it to is a mix between a baboon and a jaguar. It was terrifying and I knew that it came from the tall shadow. As if it was a command, Zeke started raining blows down on my head, pounding hammer fists over and over. I squeezed Elisa closer to shield her from the blows. I could take the pain, I wanted it. Zeke then tried to pull me off of her, but I held on. And that's when I realized that Zeke had lost his strength. His blows hurt, but they were the blows of a normal man. He couldn't even pull me away from Elise. A small beacon of hope bloomed in my soul. Zeke was tiring. Zeke began cursing me. Hopefully he was reading my mind as I thought the most heinous things about him. And then he reached for my gun on my hip. I have a level 3 retention holster, meaning that you have to press a button, push it down, and rock it forward to release it from the holster. It takes practice, but Zeke manipulated it smoothly and pulled it away from me. I half turned to face Zeke, still shielding her away from him. Zeke huffed and pointed my gun at me with a shaky hand. "You would die for her, you pig," he screamed at me. "Yeah, you backwoods inbred," I spat in defiance. I had already accepted my fate. If I was to die at least, let it mean that Elisa would survive. One honorable thing during a life of failure. "I'll kill you and then I'll kill your girl anyways," Zeke shrieked. I closed my eyes and waited for the hot bullets to pierce my body. What does being shot feel like? Will they make it quick and go for the head? Closed casket for sure. But the shots never came. 10 seconds felt like 10 hours before I opened my eyes. I cradled Elisa's drenched and shaking body tightly. I tried to meet the creature's piercing stare, but it was too much. It projected so much anger into my heart. I knew this was the end. At least Zeke wouldn't get the satisfaction. But I didn't know what untold horrors the creature would perform on me. Maybe I would be taken away like Zeke, locked away within this unholy creature. "Just leave her," I said. The entity just stared back silently, the rain wiping around it. And then I heard a deep rumbling coming from it. Was it laughter? It was. A wicked sound. It began to back away from me as the deep chuckle continued. The thing made it to the edge of the tree line, and all I could see was its reflecting eyes floating in the storm. And just like that, it disappeared. It was over. It took a minute for it to register with my rattled mind, but I knew in my heart that it had left. The fog over my soul had lifted. I sat Elise on the stump and stared up into the sky. The rain felt refreshing instead of drowning. I won't bore you with the after-action report of the mountain of paperwork that followed, but I fished my gun out of the water and I silently helped Elisa limp back to her house. Not a word said between us. I mean, what was there to say? Oh, and the backup still hadn't arrived yet. The baby was fine, if not a little bruised, and the EMT took Elisa to the hospital. She had returned to a semi-catatonic state, not saying anything for about a week. She finally did start talking again, but she claimed that she didn't remember anything. I consider it a mercy. She and her child went to live with her parents. They told me that she had extreme night terrors every night, but quickly forgot them upon waking. Hopefully, she can have a normal life for her child, but she will never be the same. Evil had left its stain on her. I kept my report short and sweet. I wisely chose to omit the shadow monster and the dimension of torture that Elisa was in. I left out the part about emptying 7 rounds into an unkillable demon-powered man. I just told the narrative of chasing Zeke out of the house and into the woods where I rescued Elisa. Oh, and Zeke may have an injury to his eye. It was too dark to tell how bad that I had hurt him. That same night, Zeke's brother had died. It was in the papers the next day. He was locked up in the neighboring county. He had suffered a heart attack in his cell. There was a whole investigation. The video showed him banging on the door and crying for help. But there was a big fight in another part of the jail, so nobody heard or paid attention to his cries as he died alone. I stayed with the department for another month. They put a warrant out for Zeke for burglary and assaulting a police officer, but I never expected him to turn up. Until one day he did. My sergeant had come into the office with a big smile on his face. He let me know that they had found my guy. He said that Zeke was found on some hunting lease in a neighboring county. Sarge slapped down a folder with pictures in it. I opened it to see a familiar sight. A clearing with a tree stump in the middle. Another younger tree growing out of the middle of it. And there hung the body of Zeke dangling from the noose. His body was bloated and rotten. I turned the page to see a picture with a closer look. He wore the ratty black raincoat and his left eye was missing. "What happened?" I asked incredulously. Well, some hunter found old Zeke about a week ago. Guess he got tired of running and he offed himself. My sergeant spoke matter-of-factly. The strange thing is, the coroner said that he had been up there for months. Kinda messes up your timetable of events. I don't know, maybe the doc is a quack. The summer heat does speed up decomp. He was at least up there long enough for the birds to get at his eyes. I felt sick. I had a strange feeling that the Zeke I had encountered had somehow been hanging from the tree at the same time. Some sort of cruel trick played out by the power of the purple-eyed shadow. I don't know how I knew this, it was like I had always known. Before my sergeant walked into his office, he turned to face me. Can you believe that bullets were found in him? Post-mortem, they say. But people must have hated him enough to do some target practice instead of reporting him. I left the department shortly after that. See, I had been changed too, like Elise. Driving alone at night, I would be terrified of the shadows moving in my peripherals, hoping that I wouldn't catch a glint of purple. I knew that thing was still out there waiting for me on every call that I went to. I could turn any corner to see it looming there, staring at me with its hate-filled eyes. I don't know what stopped him from taking me that night, or why he stilled Zeke's hand from pulling the trigger. Maybe it was my willingness to sacrifice myself, something pure in the midst of evil. I hope it was. Rather it be Harry Potter logic or Sunday school logic, I don't care. No greater love, right? But then there's the darker thought, the one that keeps me up at night. I volunteered I had made a deal. Maybe the thing decided to honor my deal over Zeke's. Maybe I owe a debt that hasn't been paid yet. The entity is just waiting, hoping that I'll forget before he comes for me, pushing me into the void like he did Zeke. I work at another police department now. I took a step back to work in dispatch, but the call of the wild still affects me. I want to get back in a black and white and be in the field. I know that I can't live in fear. I have to reclaim my life. A test for a patrol position is coming up and I've already signed up. But there is part of me that I suppress every day just to keep moving. It lingers in the recesses of my mind. I just know it for some reason, like I do other dark things now. Whether on my deathbed at 90 or answering another disturbance call tomorrow, I'll see it again. It's inevitable. It knows me now. It has marked me. The purple eyes filled with hate. Zeke's Jesus. A few years ago, my grandfather went missing. I moved into his house immediately, and when he was declared legally gone after a while, I ended up inheriting it. It would lead to a terrible experience, one that I barely survived. For months after his disappearance, I had the same reoccurring dream. My grandfather, Chester Middleton, would be standing in the corner of the fields behind his house, his back turned to me. The night sky, a gray-black and covered in clouds that rushed by, as if they had been previously recorded and now the video was played in fast forward. He had gone missing a few months ago, and there had still been no sign of him or his body being found. "Grandpa," I said, waking up behind him, shivering and barefoot. "You're back." "Not yet, Johnny," he said in his usual slow way. It was strange to have a conversation with someone's back, and I had to lean forward to hear his quiet words. "But soon I will be. You will find me and bring me home." "But how could I find you? It's so dark here," I said, squinting just to make out his silhouette. I moved closer to him. "You'd be surprised at what you can find if you go looking in dark places," he said. "And some of those things will also find you." He turned then, showing half of his face blown off, the teeth and bone below showing off his eternally grinning skull. Look at how much they've changed me, Johnny. Look. He rubbed both of his gnarled, calloused fingers over his face, a gesture that I had seen him do countless times. A waterfall of red dripped down his body from his half-missing face, but the strange black soil where he stood drank up every drop instantly, leaving no trace at all. I awoke, screaming and covered in sweat. I ripped the covers off and jumped out of bed pacing, looking out the window into the fields behind the house. I expected to see his shadow there just like in the dream, but it was only dark fields extending on for acres. As time went on, this nightmare became a daily burden. I became afraid to go to sleep, and when I did fall into an exhausted slumber, I would always wake up screaming. The dream became longer, and at the end, my grandfather would always point to a trail in the corner of the field, one that never existed as long as I had been living at that house. Sometimes it would start to rain, fire, or the trees along the borders of the field would begin to drip that red all over the ground. White rotted hands often reached out of the trail, grasping at anything and everything yet finding no purchase. I tried taking sleeping pills, opioids, cannabis, heavy doses of alcohol, and whatever else people said would give me a dreamless and peaceful sleep. But none of it worked. I lost weight, dark circles began to appear underneath my eyes, my face becoming more and more gaunt with the passing of the weeks. Even in my waking hours, I still saw my grandfather's face, the skull underneath frozen in the endless smile of the dead. It became so bad that I began to consider things that I would have never thought of before. One of my friends from college had been heavily interested in the occult, eventually joining a secretive group known as the Golden Dawn, who were supposed practitioners of black magic. I called him up on FaceTime one afternoon, nearly hallucinating from sleep deprivation. The light seemed much brighter, and I became tired after doing nearly anything. I went to work in a fugue-like state, and the days all blended together into one never-ending hallucinatory delirium. "Johnny, buddy, how you doing?" my friend Nathan said in a calm, detached demeanor that he nearly always used. "You look a little rough around the edges." Not good," I said, explaining how my grandfather had gone missing, and how my reoccurring nightmare of the secret trail had plagued me for weeks straight. "Is this the house that your grandfather left you? The one where the small private graveyard was built on the border of the property?" I paused, trying to remember if Nathan had ever been here to visit me. My mind moved sluggishly, and memories came slowly to me now. And then I remembered that he had visited me once here during our first year at college. "How did you remember that?" I asked him, genuinely curious for the first time since beginning this conversation. He laughed. "Don't you know who's buried there? Is it kind of famous or more likely infamous?" he said. I shook my head. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said. "Well, it was long before either you or I were born, back in the early 1900s. A farmer there had killed his whole family one night. They were snowed in, and some people just think that he had gotten cabin fever. Maybe they're right, I don't know. His name was Harris McEwen, and he went through the house, slitting the throats of his 2 daughters before moving on to his wife. None of them ever woke up or tried to fight back, at least according to the police. It's like they were all in a stupor or hypnotized, or maybe just drugged or something, I don't know. He ended his killing spree by writing a note in his own blood. It was a full rambling of lunacy, talking about how he needed to protect his family from demons who lived in the fields. But he also said that there was a secret trail back there that led somewhere else. Some dark, horrifying place where the dead don't stay dead, and the dirt of the trail itself drinks blood, forever thirsty for more. I paused, waiting for the punchline. "Wait, are you serious right now?" I asked. how did nobody ever tell me about what had happened in my house? And how do you know so much about it? I grew up in this town too, he said. I listened and read, and clearly you did not. The history teacher at the high school knew all about it, as well as the members of the historical society. I guess you just never asked the right questions, or really, many questions at all. Is there anything that I can do about it? I asked. There was a long pause. I'll take a couple of others in the Golden Dawn, Nathan said. Maybe this weekend I can stay over and we'll figure out something. The rest of the week passed by slowly, but at least I had hope. I would see Nathan on Friday and maybe this would all be over. I could finally sleep again without waking up screaming every night. I could finally be at peace in my own house. Things got worse on Thursday night. I had the same reoccurring dream, my grandfather pointing at the mysterious hidden trail, and the trees all weeping red in an eerily lit twilight world. I was standing in the field when without warning, grasping hands latched onto my body, forcibly pulling my left arm while digging into my skin with fingers that felt as hard as iron. I shrieked in mortal terror, spinning around. There was a man in clothes that would have been in fashion around World War I, his teeth covered in red, small trickles of it running down his chin. His eyes were burning in their intensity, his dilated pupils staring into my face with an insane sheen. How much more must I bleed them? He asked, his voice sounding slurred and slowed. He kept having to stop and spit blood out. They told me if I bled them that I would find peace. How much more, man? I can't do this much longer. I cut their throats while they slept. I did everything they asked of me. So, why? Looking down at where he had grabbed my arm, I saw deep claw marks. I looked back up quickly at the man stepping back. His fingers were in reality white bone, sharpened to dagger-like blades. Harris McCune turned, the back of his head showing, and I saw right into his brains. It looked as if he had put a shotgun or a pistol directly into his mouth and took out the backside of his skull. There was an exit wound the size of an orange, giving me a perfect view of what had once been his brain and skull. Behind him, I saw a middle-aged woman and two teenage girls. They all had their throats cut, their dilated pupils staring straight at me as waterfalls of red ran down the front of their bodies. I bled them for the blind god, Harris McCune said. How much more blood does he need? At that point, I woke up in my bed, covered in sweat. A stinging sensation in my arm caused me to look down, where I saw the slash marks from his razor-sharp bone claws on my left arm. Nathan ended up showing with another woman that I had never met before. He said that she was a third-order magus and one of the leading practitioners of both black and white magic in the southeastern United States. None of that meant anything to me, but I was glad that I was no longer alone dealing with this nightmare. Nathan always reminded me of some German super soldier, a topic that I made jokes about with him. He stood over 6 feet tall with blonde hair and blue eyes. He was a clear gym rat at that, with huge arms and a thick chest. In contrast, the woman standing next to him was much shorter and older, though she didn't appear to have a wrinkle on her middle-aged face. Her hair was pure black and her eyes were wide and blue. This is Nora, Nathan said. I went to shake her hand, but she walked right past me, looking out into the cornfields. There's something different about this place, she said in an airy voice. I felt the need to roll my eyes, but I remembered that they had volunteered to come out of their way and spend the night simply to help me. And moreover, I remembered what desperate straits I was in. These people may be my only hope. And then she did something that sent chills down my spine. She pointed at the same spot my grandfather always pointed to in my dreams. The universe is thin here. It is a point where some may cross over or those beings from the astral worlds may enter into ours. I'm not surprised this house has been the scene of so much trouble. The killing of an entire family may not have been the cause of the thinning, but in effect, the dark spirits from the higher dimensions can use the weak minds of those afflicted by insanity, grave physical illness, or lifelong addiction to do their bidding. She stopped, taking a deep breath and closing her eyes. I didn't know if this was a part of some act or not, but I just stood there watching and waiting. After a few moments, she opened them again. I believe your grandfather somehow ended up in that same place. He's calling out for you, asking for help. Or at least his spirit is. I believe his body is dead. So, what can I do? I asked. She looked at me, her large blue eyes as cold as ice. A shiver ran down my back and I turned away from her intense gaze. You can go and help him, young man. What else are you going to do? Leave him there for all eternity? With that, she turned her back to me, pulling her purple shawl closer around her neck. I saw a quick glimpse of a tattoo with a white eye built into the center of the pyramid on her wrist. Nathan and Nora went to his car, pulling out various ingredients to begin the ritual that they assured me would open up the trail to us. I saw Nora with an ancient-looking leather-bound tome whose title read, The Book of Gates. An hour later, we were assembled at the spot where the field had met the forest. A couple 100 feet to the left, the old balcony lay in a clearing in the woods. But where we all looked now was just a cluster of pricker bushes and trees. It looked impenetrable and swampy. Nathan began taking the necessary objects out of the box while Nora still held her spellbook. 13 black candles with human remains mixed into the wax. He said to me, smiling as he spread them out in a circle. He reached back into the box and pulled out a glass vial. Some dirt from the grave of a murderer. Next, he pulled out a branch. The flowering branch of Dadara. And last of all, he pulled out another glass vial, but this one was red. The blood of a murdered virgin. How did you get this stuff? I asked him. He looked at me with a half smile. Dadara grows wild around here. As for the rest, ask me no questions, brother, and I'll tell you no lies. Nora finally spoke, looking up from her spellbook at the moonlit sky. The time to perform the ritual is running out, she said. We must begin immediately. I will not recount here how the ingredients were used, and I do not wish to be responsible for anybody else trying to repeat the ritual. The horrors that ritual unleashed cannot be easily comprehended. As Nora finished speaking the last Latin incantation necessary to open the hidden trail, a feeling of anxiety and terror took over my heart. I wished that I could just run away at the moment and never come back to this cursed house, but it was just the house I knew. My grandfather might be out there, and if so, I needed to help him. One moment, I was looking at the thick wall of bushes, ferns, and swampland. As soon as I blinked my eyes, the trail was there with soil as black as obsidian. I took a step back, falling on my back as I tripped over a candle. It's okay, Nathan said, bending down to give me a hand. The ritual worked perfectly. We've opened the pathway. I looked up, squinting and peering down the black trail. Everything looked strange. The trees were not native to this region. They had dark red bark and thorns ran all up and down their exterior. Their leaves were curved into the shapes of a scythe, and the strangest of all, they exuded a resinous sap that trickled down their bark, a sap that looked like thick and dark blood. Nathan reached into his pack, pulling out 2 pistols. He handed one to me, giving me his crooked half smile. Just in case, he said simply. I took it, making sure the safety was on. He handed me a simple chest holster as well, which I put on over my shirt. Nathan had an identical one under his jacket already, which he used to holster his pistol. Picking up his bag, he nodded at Nora and me. All right, let's do this, he said excitedly. Nora shook her head. You better tamp down your glee, young man, she said. There are things along that trail that would drive you insane simply by looking at them. There are things that would suck your blood out or dismember you while you're still alive. Remember, we are only going to get his grandfather out of there and then we leave immediately. If he's dead, we will free his spirit. If he's alive, then we'll grab him and guide him out. Understood? Nathan nodded, apologizing sheepishly. Keep an eye out also for what we seek. The bark of Zekum, the blood of the Ancient One, and the soil from the endless stairs. I found this curious, but I didn't ask about it at the time. We started walking. The moment that we passed through the threshold of the trail, I could feel it. There was a buzzing noise like being directly underneath high-voltage power lines, and a smell like ozone had filled the air. It wasn't unpleasant, but it seemed to indicate that whatever this place was, it was full of energy. As we walked further away from the threshold, I looked back, expecting to see the field and house in the distance. But to my surprise, there was only an endless, winding black trail behind me, leading into a group of desolate, rocky canyons that I had never seen before. Apparently, we were stuck here. Up ahead, I heard a chattering of teeth and a low moaning noise. We came across a sharp turn to the right, and a massive tree stood there hundreds of feet tall. It had no leaves or fruits. Instead, demonic heads hung from the branches, swaying softly in the wind. Their faces were flat and deflated looking, their eyes pure black or glowing red. They opened and closed their mouths slowly in time with the breeze, creating the constant chittering noise. It was as if they were freezing to death, even though the air was warm and humid. Nora put out a hand, stopping us abruptly in front of the tree. Beyond, I saw the black trail split into 7, some ascending and others descending. There were no signs or indications of which trail was the right one. The tree of Zekum, Nora said softly, looking at the strange fruit that the tree produced. As she said its name, the eyes of the demon heads all turned to look at her. Their expressions ranged from fury to disinterest to obvious pain. Their sunken, emaciated faces then examined me and Nathan. "Do you know the way?" Nathan asked her. She shrugged, apparently unafraid of the horrific sight in front of us. "They know the way," she said, pointing to the heads. "We only need to ask them." I had my doubts about this, but said nothing. She stepped forward. "Those who are one with the holy tree of Zekum," she said, "we ask for your help. We are travelers lost on the trail. We look for one who has come here before us, an old man who came from the fields nearly 4 months ago. His name," she turned to me, "his name is Chester Middleton," I said loudly and confidently, stepping forward. "He's my grandfather. He has gone missing from my world. Have you seen him?" At first, nothing happened, though the chattering of teeth stopped. Hundreds of pairs of eyes focused on me in the utter silence. Not a bird sang or an insect hummed in the stillness. All at once, the mouths of every decapitated head opened, and a voice emerged from all of them simultaneously. It was deep and gurgling. "We have seen the one you seek," they said in unison. "Give us a sacrifice of blood and we will tell you the way." I looked at Nora, one eyebrow raised. She nodded at me, holding out a dagger. "They want some of your blood to feed the tree," she said. I gaped at her. "Just a little, just cut your arm or hand or whatever you feel like and leave a few drops of blood on the roots of the tree. They won't help us without a sacrifice from you, no matter how small that may seem. After all, you are the reason that we're here." I took her ceremonial dagger, gazing down at the rubies and opals that adorned the handle, the curved blade with strange hieroglyphs marking its steel surface. I did as she said. Walking up to the tree, standing directly next to it, I realized just how huge it really was. I had seen the redwoods in California, and this was taller than any of those. Its black bark looked ancient, with deep gouges and cracks running up and down as far as the eye could see. I put my left arm out where the trunk disappeared into the soil, putting a small slash into the top of my skin. A small trickle of blood ran down my skin, dropping into the soil below. As soon as it touched the dark ground, the earth sucked it in. The trees seemed to sigh with pleasure, the heads all smiling at once in unison, their eyes all looking down at me. "Your grandfather is on the 7th path," they said. 7, the holy number, the number of strength and mysticism. Take no other path unless it is death that you seek, and you may find it regardless. And then they went silent, closing their mouths. A strong breeze blew down the path and they began to chatter again, returning to their previous expressions of mixed pleasure, pain, fury, and sadness. Nora stepped forward, taking the dagger back. She peeled a small piece of the black bark off of the tree, wrapping it in a silken cloth and placing it in her bag. I wiped the blood away on my shirt, returning to my group. We looked at the 7 trails. I wondered what the first 6 held. Without hesitation, though, we took the last one, walking forward to find my grandfather, or whatever was left of him in this cursed place. As we walked forward on the trail, we saw a flickering light up ahead, illuminating the blood-red trees in a fiery glow. "What is that?" I asked Nathan and Nora. They walked in front of me side by side, quiet silhouettes in the dark night. A creeping sense of dread rolled through me. "Whatever it is, it belongs to the trail," Nathan said. "This trail is older than human civilization, older than humanity itself most likely. The ancient ones have long lived in the space between universes, hiding in plain sight, coming out when they need to feed. They used to feed on the pain and suffering of animals, but ever since humans began to spread, they've grown accustomed to more sophisticated tastes, let's say. Many of the ancient stories are based on true places," Nora continued. "The river Styx and the ferryman Charon, for example, were based on visions of the mystics from ancient times. The souls of the dead wander in places like this, eternally trying to cross over to the other side. Their loneliness and despair feeds the beings in this plane of existence. But we have protection against them, right?" I said. "They just kept walking, right?" "Well, some," Nathan admitted. "But some of them might drive you mad just by looking at them. There is no such thing as guaranteed absolute protection in a place like this. I just hope the trees sent us on the right path, because the wrong path would lead to something far worse than just lost souls." The light grew brighter as we approached it. Soon I could see a massive fire on the left side of the trail, blue and orange flames flickering off of it and illuminating everything around for hundreds of feet. In front of it stood a child. She looked only 5 or 6 years old. She had a little blue dress on with dirty blonde hair and blue eyes. As I got closer, I saw that she had an ear-to-ear grin on her face. "Go slow," Nathan whispered back to me. Nora looked totally unfazed. She just stared down a few feet in front of her as if nothing was disturbing about this in any way. The child's head began to turn to the right, and then it kept turning. It spun backwards on her head, the skin on her neck stretching as the bones cracked and the tendons snapped, then finished turning in a complete circle. Blood was pouring from her eyes now, and her teeth had lengthened into points. "Do you come to join the circle?" she asked in a low and childish voice. "We have many before you who have come, and they still stay here." She pointed behind her to the fire, which suddenly went out. I saw blackened, smoking corpses lying on the ground there, still moving their arms and trying to turn their heads, their mouths opened in silent screams. "We do not come for you," Nora said. looking up and making eye contact with the demonic girl. "And how do you know that we then do not come for you in return?" she asked, her face staying forwards now, the skin still stretched around her neck in a disturbing and twisted manner. "We do not appreciate visitors here. This is no place for the living." Her limbs seemed to lengthen, her broken neck stretching out as her eyes darkened to pure black. Fangs began to emerge from her mouth. The corpses behind her twitched and moaned, trying to scream, but their melted and damaged faces just made small gasping noises. The girl laughed as she transformed into a creature straight out of my worst nightmares. All of her limbs were twisted, broken and oozing dark blood now. She began to walk towards us on legs with the bones poked out through the skin. Each step made a crunching and grinding sound as the broken bones rubbed together. Nora began to chant, her eyes rolling back in her head. The language was low and growling and hissing. It was like nothing that I had ever heard before. She reached in her pocket, grabbing a leather pouch and sending a shower of silver dust forward. The demonic girl screamed as it touched her. She began to revert from a mutated nightmarish creature back to the facade of a sweet little girl that she had taken when we first walked up here. Without hesitation, Nathan pulled out his gun and fired at her, hitting her in the stomach. The bullet went right through her small body, sending out a spray of flesh and bone from her back. The girl shrieked at him, her mouth disengaging and opening wide. Her cries were so loud that they made my ears ring. They seemed overlapping and continuous. And then she turned and ran, leaving behind drops of black blood as she fled the scene. Without hesitation, Nora pulled a small glass vial from the inside of her satchel. After a minute, she had succeeded in capturing some of the blood from the injured creature. It looked like oil in the glass, shimmering and sending off iridescent colors as it splashed back and forth across the vial's bottom surface. "The blood of an ancient one," she said to herself, so quietly that I almost didn't hear her at all. I was badly shaken up. My hands trembled. The gun that Nathan had given me was out, but I didn't really have confidence that it could kill everything here. A little girl shot with this caliber should have been on the ground bleeding out, but she had just been injured and was still able to run. As we walked past the moaning, burnt bodies in the ground, Nathan bent over and put a bullet into the foreheads of each of them in turn. They stopped moving. I was glad. The girl had called these tortured souls her circle. How many more were there in this place just like them? I had wondered. I didn't have long to think about it though. The scenery was changing all around me. The dark red bleeding trees had begun to thin out, and behind them, I saw endless fields stretching to the horizon in every direction. They weren't growing food, however. Crucifixes had been nailed into the ground in straight rows. Every single one had a body on it. There were thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands. It was impossible to tell. The lines made a sight almost like an optical illusion as the cross symbol was repeated over and over, until they blurred together in the distance and disappeared. Men, women, and children bled from their hands and feet where they had been crucified, dripping fresh red into the earth below. Ropes had been tied around their arms and legs to add more strength to the bindings, and likely to keep the nails from just ripping right through their palms. They continuously tried to push themselves up from the slanted wooden block their feet were nailed to, taking in a breath as quickly as they could before slumping back down. This process repeated over and over. The endless suffocation, the pushing up, the collapse back down, until eventually, the victims were too tired from exhaustion. At this point, their heads would loll and their eyelids would begin to shut, their lips turning blue as they suffocated on the cross. As I watched, I realized that many had already passed, and more were joining them every minute. Others looked fresher and some even screamed out to us begging for help, pleading for us to let them down and save them from this horrible fate. I looked over at Nathan, who was walking directly beside me. "Just ignore them," he said gruffly. "They're not really alive, you know. You couldn't even help them if you tried." "They belong here," Nora said. "They feed the trail. The earth itself feeds on their blood and suffering here. Remember that you are only here for one." I nodded, refocusing myself. I had to find my grandfather. The moans and screams followed us for miles. The field seemed to never end. The dark soil of the trail just twisted through them, serpentine and winding, until finally I saw a break up ahead. The trees had started up again, and in the middle of the path, I saw a circular rung of black metal. "Ah, good," Nora said. "I thought we would never get here." Closing in, I saw the black metal was actually the railing for a staircase. The trail ended as suddenly as it had begun. A cluster of ferns and thorns grew wild beyond it, and the darkness of the forest was nearly impenetrable. I saw white eyes reflecting light back at me as I peered deeper inside. The eyes would have been bodies at least as tall as me, but no human eye ever reflected such a silver glow in the dark. "The endless stairs," Nathan said, peering down. He wasn't exaggerating. As I looked at the circular railing spiraling down and down, they really did seem endless. Nora knelt beside the stairs, taking a knife and working off some of the grayish-blue soil that started on the top rung and clung to every stair as far as the eye could see. She grabbed a vial and gently poured some of the strange substance into it, sealing it tightly and putting it into her satchel. I grabbed a huge rock from the nearby woods. Out of curiosity, I dropped it down the opening in the center of the circular staircase. It took off, falling faster and faster. Following its progress down so many stories gave me a sense of vertigo and nausea. I had to look away. I listened for a loud clanking noise or any indication that I had hit the bottom, but none came. After about 30 seconds, we all looked at each other. "Let's do this quickly," she said. "We have nearly everything that we need now." Nathan nodded. I wondered what exactly these two were plotting. "What do you plan to do with all the stuff that you're collecting here?" I asked. She shrugged. "They're just rare and expensive ingredients. In my line of work, only a fool would waste such an opportunity." She averted her eyes as she spoke, and I got the feeling that she was lying. "Let's go," Nathan said, pressing the button to release his magazine and refilling it with bullets. "This is by far the most dangerous part of the journey. Keep your wits about you and your gun out." We went down the stairs, each of us holding tightly to the railing. The clanging of shoes against metal was the only sound, besides the slight breeze that blew through, even down here under the earth. After what seemed like 20 minutes of descending, I saw an aberration in the staircase. A door was built into the wall with a strange symbol etched into the wood. It looked like a Backwoods 7 with a slash through it. The three of us stood in front of it, examining it. I pressed my hand against the door and realized that it wasn't made of wood. Using my flashlight, I examined it closely. The door was warm and pulsating. It appeared to be wrapped in human skin. "Better open it," Nathan said to me. I looked up at him and then wrapped my hand around the knob. It was warm and pulsating just like the rest of the door. Without a second thought, I turned it and flung it open. We all peered inside. At first, it just looked like a curtain of blackness. I shone the flashlight, but it did no good. I walked through. It felt like thousands of small fingers were running along my skin as I entered. The sensation gave me chills. They were cold, hungry, grasping fingers, and they weren't used to the warmth and the light of the living. But after a few steps, the darkness broke. and I saw that I was standing in a long hallway. The floors, walls, and ceilings were all made of dark stone. Looking back, I saw Nathan and Nora emerge from the cloud of blackness. They nodded at me, looking pale and uncertain. "This is the first circle," Nora said. "We should find your grandfather somewhere around here." A room emerged on the left as we walked further in. I looked in, seeing the horrific scene from my nightmares. Harris McCune stood there, surrounded by the still living bodies of his family. His wife and daughters were choking on their blood and their lips were turning blue as they laid in bed. They tried to claw their way forward, ripping at the sheets and mattress, dyeing everything red. Harris turned to look at us, smiling. The back of his head was missing, but his face was intact. "Finally, it is almost over," he said. "You fools, you idiots. You woke him up. You woke up the blind god and now he's coming. He's coming, he's..." Nathan didn't hesitate. He raised the pistol and started firing at Harris. Holes opened up all down Harris's chest and he stopped talking, looking down in surprise. A look of happiness crossed his face as he fell back, his eyes fluttering then closing as an expression of peace came over his unmoving body. I had lost sight of his wife and daughters in the shootout. Looking down, I saw a little girl that crawled right up to me, her throat leaving a blood-red trail from the bed to my feet. Without hesitation, she reached a bony clawed hand up and raked it down my leg. It shredded my pants and I felt the punctures go all the way into my muscle. "She got me," I screamed, and started shooting blindly down at the ground. Blood poured down my leg. I stumbled back to the entrance, dragging my bad leg behind me as I went. The three of us got out of there and slammed the door shut. "Wrong room," Nathan said, sweating heavily. He started laughing. I sat down and we wrapped a piece of cloth around my leg, tightening it to help stop the bleeding. Luckily, it hadn't punctured any major vessels and I could still walk, but it hurt like crazy. There was another room on the left. We opened it and it revealed what looked like a medieval castle's main chamber. Corpses had been skinned alive, their intestines out of their body and spiraling away from them, looking like snakes in the light glow of the castle's torchlight. And then, with mounting horror, I realized that they weren't corpses at all. The one closest to me had raised its head, its face totally missing, its eyes ripped out. I could see every muscle of its head as it tried to speak. "The blind god is coming," it said. "The blind god did this. The blind god is coming and you're next." It started coughing, trying to use its body to approach the door. The rest of the people did the same, trying to push themselves up on legs without skin, pulling themselves over small pebbles in the floor that got stuck to them and started new small cuts all over their front. They started to reach their arms out towards us, pleading. Some had their tongues cut out, and they could only make indiscernible vowel sounds. Most of them wept, at least those who still had eyes. I felt transfixed. I stared at this mass of wretched humanity. Every single one of them was still somehow alive. The floor of the castle was covered in so much clotted, thick blood that a slight ripping sound occurred every time one of the people lifted an arm or leg up while crawling forward along the tacky stone. Nathan pulled me back, slamming the door shut. "Don't look in there," he said. "There are endless rooms like that one. It'll serve you no purpose to go looking in there." "But what if my grandfather is like one of them? What if he was in there?" I felt feverish and panicked. Nathan shook his head. "I doubt it," he said. He wouldn't elaborate. We kept walking forward down the hall. We found another room further down on the right. I opened it and to my amazement saw my grandfather's fields. He stood in the middle totally intact with his back to us. It reminded me of my dream. "Grandpa!" I yelled at him. He turned around and his face was half torn off. "Oh my God, Johnny," he said, running up to me. The half of his face that was still intact formed a calm smile. I hugged him tight. "How did you find me?" "Don't you worry about that. Are you okay?" I asked. I immediately regretted asking it. What a stupid question, I thought to myself. My grandfather shook his head. "I'm sorry, son, but I'm dead," he said. "I was attacked in the fields and dragged here. I died on the way. Something tore half my face off. I didn't see what it was, but I remember dying. It was cold, and then I woke up here in these fields. But Johnny, I have to tell you, I'm not alone here." A chill ran down my spine at this. "What do you mean, not alone?" "There's something coming," he said, looking back and pointing. I followed his finger. In the distance, I saw a tiny silhouette. I squinted, trying to make it out. It floated above the ground, moving at a superhuman speed, coming closer to the door. Whatever it was, its eyes had been torn out, leaving only black sockets. It was naked, torn up, and shrieking. It looked at least 10 feet tall, and its shining black skin clung to its frame tightly. The noise that it made was so piercing that I tried to cover my ears as it got closer and closer, but it didn't help in the slightest. I could no longer hear what my grandfather said, but I saw him mouthing the same word over and over. The blind god. We pulled my grandfather forward through the door and slammed it shut. I heard that shrieking, nearing faster and faster. I looked between Nathan and Nora. Nora was slowly taking ingredients out of her pack, as if there was no rush in the world. "Ah, yes," she said, turning to Nathan quickly. "This is the perfect spot for the ritual. I can feel the energy flowing through this hallway. Dozens of worlds colliding down here in the first circle. What a beautiful sight. What an absolutely powerful feeling." Nathan nodded, sweating heavily. His eyes darted back and forth down the hallway. And then we all heard the blind god on the other side of the door, very close now. His full attention turned to that, but Nora kept talking. "I forgot to tell you, Nathan. Before I can transcend, I need one more ingredient. The blood of a betrayed friend." Smiling sweetly, she pulled out a knife and shoved it into Nathan's stomach as she spoke. He fell with a cry and she kicked his gun away. Slowly, methodically, she traced her fingers in the blood that poured out of him onto the stone floor, licking it off with a moan of pleasure. I love it when it's still warm." She knelt down, putting the fronts and backs of her hands in the puddle of blood until they were totally covered, looking like wet crimson gloves pulled tight over her normal skin. As Nathan crawled away, puddles of blood leaking out of him far too fast, she started the ritual. I started to raise the gun to shoot her, maybe in the leg or in the arm, to stop her from whatever madness she was preparing to unleash. But with a swish of her hand and a cry, I felt the gun ripped away from me and flung down the hallway. She was distracted, however, having already begun the ritual. My gun was far away now, but Nathan's was closer. Using the few seconds of distraction or focus on the ritual had allowed me, I sprinted over to it, grabbing it off the floor. As I ran towards it, I kept track of Nora out of the corner of my eye. She poured the demon child's blood from the vial in her mouth and then, holding the blood under her tongue, blew the dust from the endless staircase in front of her. Holding out the piece of the tree of Zachem in front of her, she walked into the cloud of dust. The cloud seemed to sit there frozen in time, the particles reflecting the sunlight and shimmering, and yet neither moving in the breeze or descending towards the ground. Nora began to scream in pain as she reached the center of the cloud. Her eyes started to melt, dribbling down her cheeks. The skin and muscle holding her jaw in place did likewise, and the jaw fell down lower and lower, held on by increasingly thin tendons and pieces of flesh. The tree root had started to grow, sending out leafy shoots and thick dark roots in all directions of her body. Her milky white skin was soon totally covered in an impenetrable bark. She fell on her knees, vomiting up huge quantities of it. Soon it looked like pieces of her stomach and intestines were coming up as well. Her body was changing, morphing, growing before my very eyes. Her spine was stretching, the bones breaking and reforming. Pieces of bone shot out through her fingers and feet, very long and sharp. Soon all of her clothes had ripped away. She was crouched on the floor in a fetal position, sweating blood from the bark-like texture of her skin, as bony spines started to shoot out of her back. This clawed, a demonic figure looking nothing like the woman that I had come in here with. At that moment, the door was smashed into pieces, and the huge creature my grandfather had referred to as the blind god came into the hallway. Bent double, it barely fit through the shattered door. It looked like a poisonous snake had merged with a blind giant. Shreds of black robe still clung to its body in a few places, and giant reptilian claws jutted out of its hands and feet. With a shriek, it ran at the transformed Nora, biting at her and raking its claws across her back, puncturing the bark-like skin and sending rivers of red flowing out of her. She fought back with equal ferocity, biting with razor-sharp fangs and using her sharpened bony spikes to rip at every exposed area of flesh on the creature's body. "Run," I said, grabbing my grandfather's shoulder and hauling him away. Nathan stumbled and fell, sending droplets of red scattering all over the earthen walls. He tried to follow, but he was slow, wavering, grabbing at his side as he coughed up frothy, bloody spit. We ran back up the staircase, past all the tortured souls who still screamed out for us. I saw another little girl blocking the trail. Stopping cold in my tracks, I pointed the gun at her. Without warning, I started firing, using up the entire magazine. Her head and chest had split open. Black, oily blood dripped out of her as she fell slowly backwards, a demonic grin still plastered across her face. I grabbed my grandfather and got us out of there. Even as I looked back, I saw some of her skin starting to stitch itself back together, though she still hadn't risen. But we had almost made it home. I could see the field of my grandfather's house in the distance at the end of the trail, a tiny pinpoint on the horizon that came closer and closer to us with every passing moment. My grandfather took my hand as we ran towards the entrance of the trail, squeezing it reassuringly. I was seeing spots from running so long. My chest had stitches all up and down it, but it wasn't slowing down until I was safe and away from this insane place. "You did the right thing, son," he said through gasps, tears running down the part of his face, blood streaming down the rest. "I never deserved a grandson as good as you." And then we hit the invisible wall dividing my grandfather's property from this trail. As we ran through it, I felt his grip slacken and then release. Looking over, I saw his body rapidly fade, dissolving and blowing away in the wind. I had freedom from that cursed place. I looked back and to my total surprise saw Nathan still alive. He was a little off in the distance, at least a quarter of a mile, limping slowly, his clothes covered in blood. He came through the barrier, collapsing in my arms, hyperventilating and in clear pain. "Please," he said, "help me, it hurts so bad." I laid him down in the soft dirt of the field and called an ambulance. I lit a cigarette as I waited, thinking about all the unbelievable things that had happened, wondering if Nora was still alive, or if she were right now being tortured by that insane and blind monstrosity that we had encountered. But as I listened to Nathan's ragged breathing and moans of pain, I knew one thing for certain. I used to be afraid of my nightmares, waking up every night in a sweat, screaming at the darkness. But I'm not afraid of them anymore. Now I know waking life is so much worse.